Welcome back to my channel, where elegance meets mystery, and the smallest details reveal the greatest secrets. I am Hercule Poirot, and I believe that every crime, no matter how clever, always leaves behind a trace. With my little grey cells, I observe what others overlook. A misplaced button, a single footprint, a silence that speaks louder than words. Here, we journey together into the shadows of human nature, where deception hides in plain sight, and truth waits patiently to be uncovered. So stay close, because in this world of secrets, the game of deduction has only just begun. Chapter 1. The Wine That Tasted Like a Shy. Must confess, dear reader, that the evening in question began with all the promise of comfort, refinement, and good cheer. The setting was the stately and somewhat theatrical residence of Monsieur Lucien Montclair, a French vintner of international renown whose collection of rare wines had long been the subject of reverent whispers in London's more exclusive clubs. I, Captain Hastings, found myself there by a stroke of luck, invited, not on my own account, but as a companion to Hercule Poirot, whose presence had been personally requested by Montclair himself. The dining room was an elegant vision, high ceilings ornamented with frescoes in faded gold, candlelight casting warm halos over polished crystal. A long mahogany table groaned under the weight of delicacies, glazed duck, oysters on the half-shell, and an array of cheeses so pungent they might have cleared the trenches at Ypres. The guests, numbering 12 in all, represented a cross-section of Montclair's social world, men and women of wealth, artistry, and influence, each with that faintly competitive air common to those accustomed to rare invitations. The centerpiece of the evening was to be the uncorking of a 1787 Chateauneuf antique vintage so rare that Montclair claimed it had once passed through the cellars of Thomas Jefferson himself. There was an almost theatrical hush as the butler presented the bottle. Its glass was blackened with age, the label a ghostly scrap. Montclair, smiling with a pride that approached reverence, personally poured a measure into each guest's glass. It was then, as the first sips touched lips, that the atmosphere shifted. I do not pretend to have a refined palate, but even I detected something amiss. A bitterness not sharp, but hollow and pervasive lingered on the tongue, as though the flavor itself had been drained away, leaving only a dry shadow. A lady opposite me, pale and elegant, hesitated mid-swallow, her brow creasing. Another guest coughed discreetly into his napkin, and yet Montclair raised his glass with a flourish, drinking deeply, his eyes scanning the table for approval. Poirot did not drink. He had swirled the wine gently in his glass, held it up to the light, and merely touched it to his lips before setting it down again. I saw the little furrow appear between his brows, the one that means some small, seemingly trivial fact has disturbed his perfect sense of order. The evening did not proceed as planned. Conversation grew strained, the laughter slightly forced, and then, quite without warning, the distinguished art dealer, Monsieur Armand Bellevaux, who had been seated near the head of the table, sank forward with a faint gasp, his glass spilling its contents in a deep crimson stain across the white tablecloth. For a moment, no one moved. Then the lady beside him cried out, and the room erupted into confusion. Montclair rose in alarm. The butler rushed forward, and I, acting more from instinct than thought, pushed back my chair to assist. But it was no use. Bellevaux's face had gone ashen, his lips slightly parted, his eyes staring fixedly ahead. It was then that I caught sight of Poirot ready at the man's side, his fingers lightly touching the pulse at the neck, his expression grave. "He is dead," Poirot announced softly, and in that instant the laughter and the wine and the candlelight seemed to dissolve, leaving only the cold reality of a corpse at the feast. The police were summoned, of course, but in the brief, tense minutes before they arrived, Poirot's eyes moved restlessly about the table. I know him well enough to recognize the signs. He was already at work, noting the precise arrangement of glasses, the smudges on the decanter's neck, the expressions shock, feigned or genuine in each guest's face. Later, when I remarked upon the extraordinary suddenness of Bellevaux's death, Poirot only shook his head. "Nan, mon ami, it is not the suddenness that troubles me. It is the taste of the wine. Wine should be full of life." Yes, and yet tonight, it tasted like ash. He did not explain further, but I had the distinct impression that in that single, cryptic remark lay the seed of a mystery that would prove more tangled and more dangerous than any we had yet encountered. Chapter 2. The first clue the police arrived in the form of Inspector Barrow, a square-jawed man whose manner suggested that he considered all drawing-room soirees an unnecessary impediment to more solid police work. He took immediate command, his voice brisk, asking the guests to remain in their seats, while 2 constables began cordoning off the dining room. Montclair, pale and visibly shaken, sat rigid at the head of the table, his hands clasped so tightly on the armrests that the knuckles stood out like marble. Poirot, meanwhile, moved with his customary precision. He neither intruded upon the inspector's authority nor remained idle. Instead, he began a quiet circuit of the table, his gaze never hurried, yet missing nothing. I trailed behind, aware that to the untrained eye his motions might seem almost casual, but I knew each glance, each pause, was deliberate. The decanter of the 1787 Chateau Lafleur stood near Montclair's place, its dark, viscous contents catching the flicker of candlelight. Poirot bent over it briefly, his nose an inch from the neck of the bottle, and then examined the glasses nearest to where Beliveau had sat. The art dealer's own was tipped on its side, a ruby pool spreading towards the damask edge. 2 seats away, a glass had been emptied entirely, another held barely a sip. "It is curious, Hastings," he murmured, low enough for only me to hear, "how much, or how little, each guest has drunk." His eyes flicked to a young man at the far end, a lean figure, with restless hands who now stared fixedly at his plate. "There, for instance, one who drains his glass quickly, and there mademoiselle who barely tastes hers. Such habits, they are sometimes telling." Inspector Barrow was taking statements in his blunt manner, beginning with Montclair himself. "You poured the wine personally, sir?" "Mais oui," Montclair replied, his accent thickening under stress. "It is my pride. I would not entrust such a treasure to another." His eyes darted to the bottle, then to Bellevaux's still form. "I do not understand. He was in good health." Poirot moved closer. "You decanted it yourself." Montclair hesitated. "No, I opened the bottle here at the table." He gestured vaguely towards the butler, a tall, solemn man named Harris. "Harris brought it from the cellar," said Poirot softly, as though making a note in his mind. His eyes lingered on Harris who, for all his professional composure, had a faint sheen of perspiration at his temple. I could not help but notice other small disturbances about the table, a bread plate with a faint smear of something dark jam, or perhaps a set, just before an empty chair where a lady had been seated, but now stood aside, dabbing her eyes, a silver fork lying slightly apart from its setting, as if it had been hastily replaced. Such details meant little to me, but I knew Poirot's mind was already arranging them into patterns invisible to others. When the inspector allowed it, Poirot examined Bellevaux's chair. He crouched, no small feat for his fastidious frame steady in the tablecloth, the floor beneath, and finally the man's napkin, which had fallen half open to the ground. With a dainty pinch, he lifted it. A faint scent clung to the linen knot, the rich aroma of wine, but something sharper, more acrid. Poirot's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Curious, Hastings," he said again, folding the napkin neatly. "The ash we taste in the wine, it is not the ash of burning. Nan, it is something else entirely." Inspector Barrow gave a dry cough, as though mildly irritated. "If you've any actual evidence, Mr. Poirot, I'd be glad to hear it." Poirot inclined his head graciously. "May's been, Sir Inspector, but you will forgive me if I first complete my little promenade." As he moved on, I took stock of the guests, trying to see them through his eyes. There was the pale lady from earlier, her gaze darting toward the door, as though she longed to be elsewhere. The restless young man still drummed his fingers, now on the table's edge. An older gentleman with an impressive mustache sat with arms folded, the lines about his mouth set in a permanent expression of disapproval. And at the farthest point from the commotion, a striking woman in emerald silk regarded the scene with a composure bordering on indifference. Poirot paused beside her chair, bowing slightly. "Madame, you did not drink your wine." A faint smile touched her lips. "I am not in the habit of drinking vintages older than my grandmother," she said lightly. "I prefer something livelier." Her voice was pleasant, but there was an edge to it, as though she had anticipated his question and prepared the answer. Poirot's eyes twinkled faintly. "Tiara's been. You were wise to preserve your liveliness." By the time Barrow ordered the body removed, the mood in the room had shifted from shock to a kind of brittle unease. Conversation had all but ceased. Every movement seemed weighed down by the knowledge that one of them might have poured, or prepared, or merely allowed another's death, as the constables carried Beliveau away. Poirot leaned close to me. There is order in all things, Hastings, even in the choosing of a seat at a table. You see where Beliveau sat. You see who could reach the bottle, who could not. It is like the pieces of a puzzle, placed not at random, but with intention. I nodded, though I could not yet follow the thread. You think the arrangement was planned? I think, said Poirot, straightening his cuffs, that nothing about this evening was left to chance. And if the wine tasted like ash, mon ami, it is because someone wished for it to taste of death. He said no more, but his eyes were alight with that particular gleam I had come to recognize the moment when the case, however newly born, had already taken root in the fertile soil of his little grey cells. Chapter 3. The gathering of suspects and with the sort of gruff practicality I had seen many times in Scotland Yard men, declared that no guest was to leave the premises until the initial inquiries had been made. Montclair's grand dining-room was thus transformed from a place of indulgence to a reluctant holding chamber, its guests shifting in their seats as though their chairs had grown suddenly less comfortable. Ever the diplomat, suggested no, insisted that they all be moved into the drawing-room. It will be more civilized, he said, his hands gesturing lightly, as if arranging the very air into order. And there, we may speak with calm, without the shadow of the table, where we have all dined. His tone was gentle, but held that quiet authority which made even Barrow pause before agreeing. The drawing-room of Lucien Montclair estate was a picture of continental taste. Gilt-framed paintings of vineyard scenes, low velvet sofas, and a large marble fireplace whose embers glowed faintly in the grate. The guests gathered in a loose semicircle, some standing, others seated, each attempting some more convincingly than others to adopt an air of composure. Poirot began with introductions, moving deliberately from one to the next, as though each was a new piece on the chessboard he intended to study. Closest to Montclair stood the young man I had noticed earlier with the restless fingers. He was introduced as Julian Marchand, Montclair's nephew. His sharp cheekbones and quick, darting eyes gave him the look of someone perpetually calculating perhaps money, perhaps opportunity. He admitted, almost defensively, that he handled certain business matters for his uncle, though his tone suggested this was less out of loyalty and more out of mutual convenience. Beside him, seated stiffly, was the pale lady Madame Elise Vaux. She was a widow of some years, her delicate frame and soft voice giving her the air of one accustomed to being overlooked. Yet there was an attentiveness in her gaze, a watchfulness that hinted at a mind far more active than her demure posture suggested. I recalled that she had been among the first to notice the strange taste of the wine. At the far end, leaning against the mantel, was the older gentleman with the formidable moustache, Colonel Geoffrey Rathbone, retired from the British Army. His every word seemed to march out with military precision. He had met Montclair, he explained, through a shared interest in rare spirits, and spoke with some pride of his own collection of brandies. Yet, as he spoke, I noticed that his eyes, blue and sharp-kept, flitting towards Julian Marchand with a faint but unmistakable disapproval. The striking woman in emerald silk, Madame Celeste Duval, was next. A Parisian by birth and a patroness of the arts, she regarded the whole affair with languid detachment, her voice low and deliberately measured. She professed to have known Beliveau for years, but when pressed by Barrow on the nature of their acquaintance, she offered a smooth, ambiguous smile that explained nothing at all. Then there was Mr. Edward Latham, an English wine critic whose portly frame and ruddy complexion seemed to bear witness to his profession. He was quick to offer opinions on the vintage, on Montclair's hospitality, on the tragedy of the evening. Yet, when Poirot asked whether he had tasted anything unusual in the wine, Latham hesitated a beat too long before declaring that it had been perfectly fine. At the edge of the group stood Parrish the butler, his tall frame straight as a post, hands clasped before him. He answered only when addressed, his voice flat, betraying nothing. Yet I caught the faintest flicker of unease when Poirot inquired about the bottle's journey from cellar to table. And finally, Montclair himself, Lucien Montclair, the host, the man whose pride in his wine was second only to his pride in his reputation. He sat apart from the others, his normally urbane charm dimmed by the strain in his expression. His eyes followed Poirot constantly, as though measuring what the little Belgian might be thinking. Poirot, with an amiable smile, began to speak not in the manner of an interrogator, but of a host continuing a parlour game. He asked each guest to recount, in their own words, the moments before the wine was poured. There were slight variations. Naturally, Julian mentioned hearing a clock chime from somewhere down the hall. Elise recalled the faint sound of glass breaking in the kitchen. Colonel Rathbone remembered Montclair rising to open the bottle with a flourish. None of these details seemed remarkable to me, yet Poirot's head inclined slightly at each, storing them away as though they were vital pieces of a private map. What struck me most was the shifting undercurrent in the room. Old acquaintances were, it seemed, not so old as to be immune from suspicion. Celeste Duval's cool indifference was met with sidelong glances. Rathbone's military rigidity seemed to bristle against Julian's restless confidence. Elise's quiet observations, when offered, drew the faintest narrowing of Montclair's eyes. As the evening wore on, Poirot's tone remained perfectly courteous, yet I could see he was noting not only what was said but what was avoided. Questions about Bellevaux's personal dealings were answered vaguely. His reason for attending the dinner seemed clear enough, an interest in the rare vintage, but any deeper connection to Montclair's affairs was either unknown or carefully concealed. Inspector Barrett, growing impatient, muttered that they could sort the rest in the morning, but Poirot, lifting a finger as if to still a restless pupil, said softly, "Nan, mon cher, this evening, the arrangements of people, their positions, their movements, these are still fresh. By tomorrow, they will be blurred in the mind, adjusted to suit convenience or safety." And so the gathering of suspects ended much as it began, under the same roof, each carrying their own mixture of indignation, fear, and calculation. Outside, the winter night deepened, frost creeping up the edges of the great windows. Inside, the air seemed warmer, heavier, thick with unspoken things. As we finally withdrew to our rooms, Poirot lingered in the doorway, his silhouette neat against the dim hallway light. "It is a fine vintage, Hastings," he said, in that mild way he uses when concealing the sharpest of thoughts. "But tonight, I fear the bouquet we breathe in this house is not of the wine, it is of secrets." Chapter 4. Poirot takes measure. The night had grown heavy, the frost outside turning the tall windows into pale misted mirrors. The drawing room, with its ornate furnishings and faint scent of old tobacco, seemed a stage now, its players restless, unsure of the script. Inspector Barrow, having concluded the formalities, remained nearby in low conversation with one of his constables, but it was clear to me that Poirot had assumed the true command of the room. He did not stride in like a man taking authority. Rather, he settled himself into an armchair at the center of the gathering, legs crossed with fastidious care, his fingertips steepled beneath his chin. It was a simple arrangement, yet in the space of a few moments every eye had turned towards him, as though compelled by some unspoken expectation. "I thank you, Madame et Messieurs," he began, his voice warm, courteous, but with a thread of precision running through each word, "for your patience this evening. A tragedy such as we have witnessed it casts a shadow, and yet there is light to be found in clarity. To understand what has occurred, we must understand each other. There was a murmur of assent, some polite, some wary. Poirot's eyes, dark and clear, moved from one face to another, lingering just long enough to make the owner of that face shift slightly under his regard. First he said, "Monsieur Montclair." The host straightened, his hands folded in his lap. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot, you invited your guests tonight for the tasting of this most rare vintage, a gift to them, perhaps, but also a moment for yourself. Such an event planned long in advance." Montclair nodded. "The date was fixed over a month ago. I wished the wine to breathe in the cellar at a precise temperature before uncorking." Poirot inclined his head. "And in that month, you told each guest of the occasion?" "Not all at once. Some were invited earlier, others only last week." His gaze shifted towards Julian, who gave the faintest of smirks. Poirot's attention slid to the young man. "Monsieur Julian Marchand, the nephew, the aide in certain affairs of business, and yet, I suspect, a man who enjoys his own amusements." Julian's smile tightened. "I manage my own life, Monsieur Poirot. My uncle and I have an understanding." "Indeed," murmured Poirot, his tone one of mild curiosity, but his eyes studying the restless drumming of Julian's fingers upon his knee. Next, Madame Elise Vaux. She met Poirot's gaze with a calm, almost resigned composure. "You noticed the taste in the wine, Madame. You were perhaps the first to show discomfort." "I could not ignore it," she replied softly. It was as though it had turned to dust in the mouth. "I meant no offense to our host." "Offense?" Poirot echoed gently. "Ah, but truth is often mistaken for insult. It is a brave thing, to speak one's mind so quickly. Elise's lips curved faintly, but her eyes did not warm. Colonel Rathbone was called next. His spine was straight as a rifle barrel. You were watching closely during the pouring, were you not, Colonel? Rathbone gave a short nod. Military habit: observe everything. I noted the decanter remained in Montclair's possession, save for Harris bringing it in. Poirot's moustache twitched. And you have an aversion, perhaps, to young men with quick hands. His gaze flicked deliberately towards Julian. The Colonel's expression hardened. I have an aversion to impropriety, sir, and to those who treat an evening such as this as a stage for games. Madame Celeste. Duval's turn brought a faint arch of her brows, as though she found the exercise amusing. You are not surprised by events, Madame Poirot observed. I am French, Monsieur Poirot, she said lightly. We do not surprise Issel, and I have attended enough gatherings in Paris to know that when rare wine flows freely, drama is never far behind. Her eyes, unreadable pools of dark green, gave away nothing, though I thought I saw a flicker when Bellevaux's name was mentioned. Edward Latham was next, puffing himself up slightly. Wine critic, yes. A connoisseur, Poirot asked. I have written for the Cellar Review for 15 years, Latham declared, and I can assure you, the Lafleur was unspoiled. It was, he stopped, realizing the inconsistency, then continued briskly, complex, perhaps misunderstood by the less experienced. Poirot's gaze lingered on him for a beat longer than polite before. Moving on. Harris the butler was last. His voice was low, controlled, but Poirot's questions, seemingly innocent, pressed him into small admissions. The bottle had been stored in the locked cellar until 2 hours before dinner. He alone had retrieved it, bringing it up in a linen-lined cradle. And yes, there had been a moment when he had set it down in the pantry to attend to another matter. For how long? Poirot asked. Only minutes, Harris replied, but there was the faintest tightening of his jaw. The sequence of first impressions was complete, and yet Poirot remained silent for a moment, looking at them as a jeweler might look at uncut stones, seeing their potential facets before a single tool touched them. Finally, he spoke. You see, Mies Amos, in any gathering such as this, there is more than one vintage at the table. There is the wine and there is the company. One may be perfect, the other, how shall I say, a little corked. Some smiled faintly, others bristled. Poirot rose, bowing his head slightly to Montclair. I will speak further with each of you tomorrow. For tonight, let us remember that truth, like wine, must breathe before it reveals itself. As we left the room, I could not resist asking him quietly, Well, Poirot, have you seen enough? Seen, yes, he murmured, but not yet understood. Still, he tapped the side of his temple. The bouquet of this affair is strong, mon ami. I already scent the hint of bitterness beneath the surface, and it is not only in the wine. Chapter 5. Initial interviews. Begin. Morning in Montclair's house, arrived with the hush of snow. A fine, white powder had fallen in the night, muffling the grounds, so that even the servants' early scurryings seemed to come from a great distance. I found Poirot already immaculate, his tie-pin flashing a discreet spark of light, as we entered a small library that Inspector Barrow had grudgingly ceded for the interviews. A fire smouldered, the scent of old paper and wood polish tempering the raw chill. Poirot took the chair with its back to the window. He prefers the light on others. Faisant laid a clean notepad precisely before him, though I knew he would rely far more upon the order in his mind than upon any written line. We began with Harris, called for his proximity to the wine. He stood as straight as a regimental post, hands clasped, eyes somewhere over Poirot's left shoulder, as though reciting to a master from whom he had learned obedience but not affection. Tell me again, if you please, Poirot said softly, of the bottle's journey. Harris described the locked cellar, the cool stone shelves, the linen cradle. He had brought the Lafleur up 2 hours before dinner, set it in the pantry to settle, and gone to oversee the service of oysters. You left it unattended, Poirot murmured. For minutes only. Yes, sir. And the pantry door, did it shut with a latch? It did, sir, but it was not locked. Poirot's eyes lowered to the man's gloved hands. You wear gloves at your duties. For the service, sir, not in the cellar. Poirot nodded. And you are a man of habit of timings. Harris hesitated a fraction. We pride ourselves on punctuality. A law, said Poirot. A pantry abandoned for even 2 minutes is a disruption of such punctuality. What drew you away? Harris's gaze flickered. A tray slipped in the glass broke. I went to ensure no one was hurt. He had not told us this last night, or if he had, it had been lost in the murmur of voices. Poirot's head inclined. Glass breaking. Yes, Madame Vautrin remembered such a sound. Harris bowed. She has a keen ear. Julian Marchand came in next with an assurance that was almost insolent. He flung himself, with a grace too casual to be unconscious, into the chair opposite Poirot and crossed his legs, ankle upon knee. "We have little to discuss," he began. "My uncle's guests are not my responsibility. Your uncle's business affairs may be." Poirot returned, mild as milk. He asked about the date of the dinner, the invitations, the company chosen. Julian's answers were smooth, but bore a peculiar inconsistency of emphasis, emphatic in denying influence over the guest list, to airy about money matters, as if to make them beneath his notice. "The wine critic, Monsieur Latham, who suggested him?" Poirot asked. "Montclair himself," Julian said at once, then added, "Naturally, publicity is useful, and Colonel Rathbone, who is a collector of spirits, a mutual acquaintance." Julian shrugged. "The Colonel buys, my uncle sells, the world turns." Poirot's gaze drifted to the young man's impatient fingers drumming the chair arm. "You drink quickly," he observed. "Bad habit," Julian said. "Good wine, bad patience. And last night, when the Lafleur was poured, I tasted it." "Yes, you drained your glass." "Naturally." A fractional pause. "Or nearly." There was conversation. He smiled. "Mademoiselle Duval tells stories that make one forget one's glass." "Ah," said Poirot, "how generous to a lady." But in his eyes, I saw a spark that was not flattery. Madame Elise Vautrin glided in with that stoic composure which had impressed me. In daylight, she seemed even more delicate, but her eyes, grey and clear, accepted the room as though it were a specimen under her lens. Poirot welcomed her as one welcomes a confidant. "Madame, you noticed the taste before others admitted it." Elise's hands, slender as a pianist's, folded in her lap. "I have learned to trust the small things," she said. "They are the only things that do not lie." She described her place at table 3 seats to Bellevaux's left, midway down the long side. She had lifted the glass, inhaled, and felt a hollowness, as if scent had been stripped away. "And the ash?" Poirot asked. "Yes, not smoke emptiness." She paused, and something acrid upon the linen. Poirot's brows lifted a hair. "You noticed the napkin?" "I stepped to assist," she said, colour touching her cheeks. "It seemed right to help Madame," said Poirot gently. "When the glass broke in the scullery, you heard it." "I did." "At what time?" "When the oysters were served, a few minutes after we had sat." She looked directly at him. "I am not so certain of minutes as your butler is." "No, but you are certain of sequence," Poirot returned, pleased. Mercy Colonel Rathbone's entrance brought with it a military front of manners. He stood until invited to sit, then answered in precise clauses, as if on parade. He had admired the bottle. He had noted Harris's careful handling. He had observed Montclair pouring, and Bellevaux receiving his glass with a pleased expression. "Did you taste ash, Colonel?" Poirot asked. "I tasted disappointment." The Colonel's moustache bristled. "A wine so old ought to have the dignity of its years, not the exhaustion of them." Poirot inclined his head. "You did not drain your glass. I rarely do on a first tasting." A faint, disdainful glance towards the door by which Julian had departed. The young gulp. "You dislike him?" Poirot said pleasantly. "I distrust pot-stirring in a cellar." The Colonel replied, "And I dislike debt." Poirot's interest sharpened, though he only said, "You speak in generalities, Colonel." "A habit of men who avoid gossip. Gossip erodes truth." Rathbone returned. "But this truth, Mr. Poirot, you will find it where pride and money meet." Madame Celeste. Duval arrived as if to a matinee, perfectly composed, a faint perfume of jasmine that seemed to sketch a border round her. "I am devoted to clarity," she said with a smile that explained absolutely nothing. Poirot apologized for the discomfort of questioning. She waved it away with a languid turn of her wrist. "Bellevaux and I were friends," she said evenly. "Old Paris, old galleries, new quarrels." "Quarrels," Poirot repeated, almost idly. "Artists," she said. "Dealers. The price of beauty is blood, sometimes but more often money. And last night, we were reconciled to the necessity of civility," she said. "He wanted Montclair's favour. Montclair wanted Bellevaux's clients. A waltz." "No." Poirot watched her with deepening amusement. "And your own glass?" "Untasted," she said. "I adhered to my policy, which is to refuse what is excessively old and excessively praised. Her eyes glinted. Both are forms of flattery to themselves. Edward Latham, by contrast, brought into the library a restless timidity of self-importance. He began to opine before he sat. Let us be frank. The Le Fleur was controversial. A 200-year bottle is like a resurrected king, more myth than man. Poirot allowed the speech to run until it tangled. You found it perfectly fine last night, he murmured. This morning you call it controversial. Latham flushed. I spoke to sooth, he said. Montclair was distraught. I have no wish to ruin a man's name over the vagaries of an ancient cork. But you tasted ash. There was a dryness, Latham conceded. A desiccation. Some would call it ethereal, others dead. The line is thin, and below. He took a brave mouthful, Latham said, then faltered. May have remarked that it would open in the glass. You are a man who likes to be right in print, Poirot observed. In print, Latham repeated, grudgingly amused. One is paid to be right. Lucien Montclair, at last, faced us like a man who had rehearsed his grief in private and now presented the shortest version to the public. He spoke of provenance, of custody, of temperature, and the dignity of a wine's long sleep. Poirot listened with courtesy, then drifted towards the realm of feeling. Monsieur, you invited Bellevaux as a friend. Montclair's gaze grew guarded. As a patron, he said finally. He wished to sell a collection. I wished to acquire part of it. You would profit, naturally. A faint impatience edged his voice. What is this, monsieur? An inquest into commerce, into human commerce, said Poirot gently. There is a difference. He asked then about the seating, who had been placed where and why. Montclair spoke in the language of harmony, balancing temperaments, keeping enemies apart. Yet a curious thing emerged. Celeste Duval had been at the far end from Bellevaux, despite their acquaintance. Colonel Rathbone near the host. Julian opposite Latham. A composition, Poirot said lightly, with the strong notes well spaced. Montclair smiled without warmth. I like my table to sing. And yet last night, Poirot murmured. It coughed. Between the interviews, Poirot paced to the window and back, his steps neat, his mind riffling unseen pages. Hastings, he said once, note how they speak of time. Minutes, moments, chimes, courses. Everyone marks the dinner by a measure that suits him. Habit, pride, fear. Such clocks are rarely in agreement. I ventured that clocks are not feelings. Just so, said Poirot, but feelings control the hand that sets the clock. Barrow came in to grumble about tedium, and was surprised when Poirot asked him, quite cheerfully, for practicals, the servants' comings and goings, logged by the head housemaid, which doors stuck in cold weather, whether the pantry latch squeaked. You were building a stage, the inspector said, half amazed. Nan Poirot smiled. I am recognizing one. Then quietly, almost to himself, a pantry left, a glass broken, a napkin that smells not of wine, a critic who edits his memory, a nephew who edits his manners, a host who edits his seating like a score, and our poor beloved Ivo, who drank as if to prove something to someone, perhaps himself. As noon faded towards a pale afternoon, Poirot closed his notebook empty, except for a single dot of ink where his pen had rested. We will pause, he announced, and permit truth its little breath. He turned to me with a glint. There will come TRS beant it, a clue that pretends to be the answer. It will be fat and contented, and it will sit in the middle of the room, purring like a cat. We must not pet it, Hastings. We must observe its claws. I asked him what he expected next. An air of confidence, he said. Orbitera's second disturbance to the order, made by someone who believes the first disturbance was insufficient. He adjusted his cuffs. When people arrange death, they rarely arrange silence. We left the library to the sigh of the door. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed one, a thin metallic note that seemed to shiver along the corridor. The snowlight widened in the windows, and the hush that had dignified morning now felt like a held breath. If Poirot was right, and he usually was, then the case, which had only just gathered its company, would presently offer us its first grand deception, dressed in plausibility, and I, for one, felt that curious prickle upon the skin that precedes a storm, the sense that the next knock upon that library door would not be from Inspector Barrow at all, but from fate, asking to be admitted. Chapter 6. The first false lead. The knock, when it came, was sharp enough to make me start. Inspector Barrow entered without ceremony, his expression set in the grim satisfaction of a man who believes the game is nearly over. In one hand, he held a folded sheet of paper. Poirot, he said, I think we've got it. Harris is our man." Poirot, who had been leaning back in his chair with his fingertips pressed together, did not so much as raise an eyebrow. "Indeed, and on what basis does this assurance rest, mon cher Inspector?" Barrow laid the paper on the desk. "We searched the butler's quarters, found this tucked in a drawer, a bill of sale from a pawnbroker in the Strand. Item listed, silver wine pourer, antique, French make, date of transaction 2 days ago. Witness signature matches Harris's. I made a few inquiries. Turns out Montclair has a similar pourer missing from his collection. Harris claims it was his own to sell, but I'd wager he took it from the cellar and swapped it for a bit of ready cash. If he's willing to steal from the man's wine service, why not poison his wine?" Poirot's eyes narrowed fractionally. "And this pourer, it could, what, introduced to the wine a substance unnoticed. It's got a spout wide enough to hide any little packet of powder," Barrow said with relish. "And Harris had sole custody of that bottle before dinner." The door opened again, and Harris himself was brought in. If he was unnerved by the presence of 3 pairs of eyes fixed upon him, he concealed it beneath his professional reserve. Only the faint tightening at the corners of his mouth betrayed that he understood what was afoot. Barrow wasted no time. "This your signature?" He tapped the paper. "Yes, sir," Harris said quietly. "And the "No, sir, I own. I've had it for years." Barrow snorted. "Convenient," that Poirot interjected, his tone calm but carrying. "Why sell it now, Harris?" "A sudden need of money." A pause. "My sister in Devon. She's been ill. I wished to send her enough for the doctor's fee without troubling Monsieur Montclair for an advance." It was said plainly, without embellishment. I glanced at Poirot, who was studying the man's face as though it were a page of rare script. "And you did not think," Harris Poirot asked softly, "that such a sale, at such a time, might place you under suspicion?" "I did not expect a guest to die, sir," Harris replied, a flicker of emotion passing over his features. Barrow grunted. "You expect us to take your word for it?" Poirot rose, adjusting his cuffs. "No, Inspector, you will take mine." The silence that followed was almost comic. "What do you mean?" Barrow demanded. "I mean," said Poirot, "that Harris is not the man we seek." He began to pace, a small, neat circuit. "Consider, if you please, the pourer, if used to introduce poison, must have been employed either before the wine reached the table or during the pouring. Harris did not pour, Montclair himself poured, and as to before, that is the charming impossibility. You see, the pourer in Montclair's collection, its design, is such that any residue, however minute, would lodge in the spout. A simple rinse would not remove it. Yet the bottle, when I examined it, bore no trace of such a device being fitted. The lip of the glass showed only the faint abrasion of a corkscrew. Nothing more." Barrow's mouth tightened, but he did not speak. Poirot turned to Harris. "You may go, for now, but remain in the house." When the butler had gone, Poirot resumed his seat. "You see, Hastings," he said, "the case against Harris is how do you cite a perfect, a man with means, opportunity, and an incriminating object found in his drawer. It is a construction made to be found. Such things, they do not drop into the lap of Hercule Poirot unless someone wishes me to stop looking elsewhere." Barrow muttered something about overcomplication, but Poirot ignored him. We left the library shortly after, and I accompanied Poirot to the dining room, now cleared and cold, the morning light falling in a pale rectangle across the table. He stood at the head, looking down the length as though seeing the scene of last night in reverse. "Here, Hastings," Montclair paused. To his right, Bella, the first glass filled Believos, then to his left, perhaps to you, mon ami, or to Madame Vaux. Think of the order, think of the hands that reached for their glasses, the sequence of lips that touched the rim. He moved, almost dancing, to each place, muttering under his breath, "Nan, the poison is not in the decanter, it is in the glass." One glass eye frowned. "But surely that means—" "It means," Poirot interrupted, "that whoever killed Beliveau did not intend to kill indiscriminately. It was no test, no experiment, it was a gift wrapped for one man alone." Before I could respond, a footman appeared at the doorway, hesitant. "Monsieur Poirot, there is something you should see." He led us to a small morning room at the back of the house. On the low writing desk lay an envelope, its creamy paper oddly stark against the dark wood. Montclair stood by the hearth, looking troubled. "This was delivered not an hour ago," he said, handing it to Poirot. "Slipped under the door. No one saw by whom." Inside was a single folded page. Poirot opened it, and we both leaned in. The message was written in a neat, unfamiliar hand. Stop asking questions about the wine, or another will taste the same. There was no signature. Poirot stared at it for a moment, then looked up, his eyes glinting. "Ah, mon ami," he said, "I told you the first disturbance is never enough. And now, the second has begun." Chapter 7. The psychological game. Poirot held the threat letter to the light, as one examines a specimen on glass, admiring nothing, inviting everything to confess. "Ink common," he murmured. "Paper respectable, but not dear. A pen that scratches, see the tremor at the turn of the S. Not a natural tremor, I think. A hand that has chosen to disguise itself." He folded it once, precisely, and slipped it into his pocket. "When a murderer writes," he added quietly, "he tells you what he fears. He fears attention to the wine. Donc, we shall attend to nothing else." Inspector Barrow growled that the note changed little. They would step up searches, keep everyone contained, and watch the pantry like hawks. Poirot agreed to all of it with disarming alacrity, then proposed a small gathering in the drawing-room to restore calm. Poirot snorted. Poirot smiled. "It will do more than restore calm. It will restore candor." The suspects assembled again as they had on the first night, but daylight banished candlelit courtesies. Untrimmed nerves showed plainly. Julian lounged with deliberate indifference, though one foot tapped a staccato against the carpet. Madame Duval, perfect as ever, had tightened the ribbon at her throat. The bow sat precisely, like a mask secured. Elise Vautrin took the edge of a chair, her hands folded with a widow's composure. The colonel chose a position near the mantel, as if defending strategic ground. Latham hovered too close to the drinks trolley, a mourner haunting a buffet. Montclair stood apart, the host in a house he no longer controlled. Harris was admitted last, and placed near the door by Barrow's order. A sentry who was himself under watch. Poirot remained standing. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "a small exercise. I will ask each of you for one memory, tiny, perhaps foolish, that occurred at the table last night. Between the oysters and the pouring of the you will tell it as it happened, without embroidery, without interpretation." He lifted a finger. "We begin with what is small, because the large has already frightened us." Julian smirked. "Must we rehearse the rituals of supper?" "Oh, mon cher," said Poirot pleasantly, "you have rehearsed many rituals. One more will not exhaust you." Julian's eyes flashed, then lowered to lazy insolence. "Very well. I remember my uncle asking Harris to fetch his spectacles. Montclair said the label was a ghost, and he wanted to peer at what was left of it." Montclair gave a short, irritated laugh. "I did no such thing. My spectacles were already in my pocket." He withdrew them, tapping the case. "I never read a label at table. It is vulgar, a contradiction," Poirot said softly, almost with regret, on the very first turn. "How delicate, Monsieur Latham, a small memory." Latham dabbed his lip with a handkerchief. "I recall the oysters were uneven in size. An inconsistency easily forgiven." "Ah, and the lemon." Harris returned to the kitchen for a fresh slice after Madame Vautrin said the first had dried. "I said nothing." Elise replied at once, not sharply, simply establishing a boundary. "I prefer oysters plain." Harris inclined his head. "The second lemon was for Colonel Rathbone." The colonel gave an approving grunt. "I dislike waste. If a lemon is spent, replace it." "Bon," said Poirot. So the lemon travelled. The butler travelled. Time travelled. Madame Duval. Celeste's smile deepened, cat-like. "I recall Captain Hastings telling a joke about a German officer mistaking a cork for a medal. Heat crept up my neck. I made no such joke." "No," said Poirot, in gentle amusement. He did not. Celeste did not blush. Her serenity was armor-plated. "Then I remember nothing at all." "Ravissant," said Poirot. "A perfect vacuum." He turned to Montclair. "Monsieur." "The only thing I recall," Montclair answered, weary now, "is the cork breaking." "The cork did not break," said Poirot. "It came cleanly," with a sigh. "I have the sound in my ear still." Had he been a less mannered man, Montclair would have flinched. As it was, he merely lifted his chin. "Then we recollect imperfectly, all of us." "Not all," Poirot replied. "Some recollection is too perfect, which is another imperfection." He let the sentence hang, light as dust motes in the winter sun, and then he changed the air entirely. "And now an entertainment. The palate, it can be educated. Yes, a little lesson for the morning." He went to the trolley and, with Harris standing stiffly by, poured a thimble of 3 different wines into 3 identical glasses, a young Bordeaux, a humble table reed, and a tisane plain water steeped with a shaving of charred oak. He placed the glasses before Latham first. Monsieur la Critique, tell us which is which. Latham colored. Really, please, Poirot insisted. As charming as a cat in cream dot. We watched as Latham sniffed, swirled, chewed air with his mouth half open. He named the first as Bordeaux, it was. The second as the tisane, it was the table reed. The third as water, it was the oak. He recovered, scowling. I am not here to perform parlor tricks. No, Poirot said, but you performed one last night, when you declared the Lafleur perfectly fine while tasting that which you now call char. The room pricked with attention. Latham blustered. I spoke to preserve dignity. Whose? Poirot asked, and left the question unanswered. The pressure had shifted, as he intended. The elegant social membrane had stretched and grown thin. He drifted to Juliet. Monsieur Marching, let us pretend we are boys in a schoolroom. I give you a problem. If a bottle sits in a pantry, watched by nobody, for how many minutes? Harris, 4 or 5 at most. Sir Bean, for 5 minutes. Then, if during those 5 minutes, the pantry door opens twice, once to take a fresh lemon, once to fetch spectacles that were not needed, how many times is the bottle no longer alone? Julian's restless foot paused. If this is arithmetic, the answer is 2. But if it is insinuation, it is curiosity, Poirot said. Curiosity about who walks past a thing and who cannot resist touching it. Julian's smile returned, narrower. You think I touched it? I think, said Poirot, that you touch many things, some to know their quality, some to prove your nerve, some because you are bored. Montclair burst out. This is grotesque. Monsieur Poirot, my nephew is impetuous. Yes, but he is not a killer. Grotesque, Poirot echoed, almost kindly. The grotesque is a matter of proportion. Death at table is the worst distortion of proportion. His voice softened. Sit, Monsieur Montclair. Rage does not steady the hand. Poirot pivoted again, as if to show a different painting to the same audience. Madame Vautrin, he said, you assisted when Monsieur Beliveau fell. You noticed a scent upon the napkin. Tell us again, Acrid, she said. Not of smoke, more like bitterness extracted. Ash without fire. Poirot murmured, thank you. He turned to the colonel. And you, mon colonel, you have the soldier's ear. Did you hear a cork break? I did not, the colonel said crisply. I heard it slide free, and a breath of the wine. Exact, Poirot said, with a little bow. Thus we have a false memory created after the event, perhaps to justify a fear that the wine itself was wrong. He let his gaze settle finally on Celeste. And you, madame, who remembers so little, one question only. Had Monsieur Beliveau brought you, in recent weeks, any offer to sell, perhaps a letter, a sketch, a small treasure he hoped you would champion? Celeste met him without a flicker. He brought me the same thing all men bring, when the market shifts under their feet. Assurances. Assurances. Poirot repeated. How they evaporate. He clasped his hands. Mies, Amos, I do not ask for confessions. I ask for truths of the smallest size. From these, patterns grow. Already we see one. Each of you has, within last night, edited a memory, some to protect vanity, some to protect another, some to protect yourselves. It is very human. It is also very useful to me. Poirot, impatient, broke in. Where does this get us? Nearer to the Moniere, if not yet the motif, Poirot said. The way of Italwiz before the why. He strolled to the window and looked out at the white air. One glass was prepared. That is my conviction. Prepared by whom? Not by Harris, who could only be made to look as though he had done so. Prepared when, in that slender corridor between oysters and pouring, when errands sprouted like weeds. Prepared how? With what leaves ash upon the tongue yet does not paint the wine with its odor. He touched the pane with a fingertip. There exists such a thing. What thing? I blurted. The very thing our murderer wishes us not to name, he answered softly, and turned back with the brightness of a man who hears the overture of an idea. And so we will not name it, not yet. We will invite our adversary to believe we still chase butlers and broken corks. He thanked them and dismissed the gathering with the grace of a maître d' at the close of luncheon. But before the room dispersed, he added almost lazily, one more petty g. This afternoon, I will ask each of you for an object you carry always, something from your pocket, your bag, your room that is of no consequence, and yet would offend you if it were mislaid. A token. Bring it to the library at 3 o'clock. Latham chuckled sourly. Talismans now. Precisely, Poirot said. A man reveals his habits most clearly in what he keeps near at hand. they drifted out, murmuring, and Poirot's smile faded. He drew me aside. "We have poked the hive, Hastings. If I have judged correctly, there will be movement." "From whom?" "From the one for whom control is oxygen," he replied. "To be watched, to be measured, it will suffocate. So bad, it will make fresh air by creating a new confusion." As if on cue, Harris appeared in the doorway, colorless. "Monsieur Poirot, begging your pardon. The maid who turned down the bedrooms has reported something odd in the blue guest room. The window is open, sir, and on the Celestine." Poirot's eyes sharpened with pleasure that did not reach his mouth. "You see, Hastings, the air stirs." He took his hat. "Come, the psychological game is generous. It offers a second round to those who do not accept defeat in the first." We followed Harris into the corridor, chilled by that open window's draft. Somewhere, a door banged in the distance, and the house, which had been all hush and winter light, seemed suddenly to whisper again. Another movement on the board, another hand revealed. If only we could see it before it closed. Chapter 8. The window, and the vanishing the blue guest room was on the east side of the house. A chamber of restrained elegance, cornflower walls, a narrow escritoire beneath the window, and a bedspread whose pattern of laurel leaves seemed perversely triumphant in the cold light. Harris had not exaggerated. The sash was raised a hand's breadth, and a thread of winter air crept in with a faint hiss, making the drapery stir like the breath of a sleeper. Poirot went first to the sill. "Do not touch, Hastings," he murmured, and bent with that feline care which never broke the crease in his trousers. Upon the painted wood there was, plainly visible, an irregular halo, a ring, such as a glass might leave, but dark, almost black, with a faint, ugly sheen that reminded me of tarnished silver. He leaned closer, not sniffing exactly, but allowing the air above it to pass near his nose. "Acrid," he said softly. "Not smoke. A bitterness that clings." Inspector Barrow crowded in, grumbling at the cold. "So someone set a glass there, spilled it. A guest, careless or drunk in a house where every movement now is observed." Poirot smiled without warmth. "No, Inspector, carelessness is brave only when it believes itself unseen." Harris indicated the desk. "And this, sir?" In the shallow drawer lay a key on a ribbon, and beside it, a sliver of lint, like a dull blue petal. Poirot lifted the ribbon with 2 fingers. "A guest-room key kept in the drawer, convenient for a maid," he said absently, then touched the lint to his cuff. "Wool, not of this bedspread, which is cotton, not of these drapes, which are a silk blend, a flake from a coat. The color is exact to Colonel Rathbone's greatcoat, perhaps also to Monsieur Montclair's lounge jacket, though his is a shade deeper." He let the petal fall. "But such fragments travel promiscuously. We do not marry them yet." He crossed to the window and peered down. The snow below formed a neat ledge upon the flat of a garden border. At its edge, scarcely disturbed, lay a tiny scatter of grit-black points against the white. "Look there," Poirot said quietly. "Shards." We saw them as he said it too. 3 glints like insect eyes. Poirot would not allow them touched. He contented himself with the geography. A glass or small bottle, tilted at the sill. A little spilled on the wood. The remainder out. Barrow gave a short, satisfied nod. "Pouring out the poison, then, after using it. That settles it. This room's occupant, who occupies the blue room?" Poirot asked Harris, ignoring the inspector's leap. "Madame Duval, Sir Celeste." I remembered the perfect ribbon, the smile that absorbed and returned nothing. Poirot's gaze did not alter. "And her door?" Harris was it locked when the maid came? "No, Sir Ajar." The maid thought the draught odd, hence the report. Being Poirot lowered the sash with 2 fingers, and regarded the dull ring upon the wood. "We will preserve this, Inspector. A sheet of glass, if you please, from a picture, not precious, the backing removed, the glass laid over, and let no one rub, wipe, polish, improve. I wish to see the stain exactly as it wishes to be seen." Barrow began to issue orders. Poirot turned to the There, neatly aligned, lay a travelling blotter, a notebook in green morocco, and a sealed envelope addressed in a slanted hand, "Madame Celeste Duval." The seal was intact. He did not touch it. Instead, he opened the blotter and lifted the thin drying paper. Its underside bore the ghost of words, impressions from recent writing, too faint to read with the eye. Poirot smiled faintly and closed it again. "We will return with a pencil and an angle of light. For now observe, Hastings, the envelope is sealed, but the blotter speaks. One writes, one decides not to send, one pours out something at the window. An hour later, A maid does her duty, and we read the stage as left. Then Madame Duval is our poisoner, Barrow said, impatient. She wrote a note, panicked, destroyed the remains, and left the window open in midwinter to advertise the scene. Poirot inquired, almost gently. No, Inspector, if she is guilty, she is also a dramatist. But drama that points its own finger is usually written for an audience of one. He asked, then, for Celeste to be found. It was Harris who returned a few minutes later with the report that Madame Duval was walking in the long gallery, which in this house meant a corridor of portraits hung too high and too many, where the floorboards had the habit of speaking creaks under the lightest step. We went to her there. She turned at our approach, as if greeting an arranged appointment. Madame Poirot said pleasantly, "Your room has had the misfortune to invite the weather. Might we warm it together?" She listened to his description with a composed tilt of the head. "My window," she said, "open. How strange. I left it shut." "Ah," said Poirot. "But the strange is what visits us when we leave rooms ajar." She glanced at Barrow's set jaw, and then returned her gaze to Poirot. "You think me careless. I think you orderly," Poirot replied. "And because of that, I find the disorder charmingly theatrical." "I dislike the theatre," she said mildly. "It is too honest." "Eyes, Madame," he murmured, "you are delicious." It was arranged that nothing in the room would be moved until 3 o'clock. When the tokens Poirot had requested were to be brought, Celeste agreed without fuss. If she felt herself under suspicion, she did not strain against the tether. She merely accepted it, as one accepts a draft one adjusts one's shawl. We left her, and, at Poirot's suggestion, went next to the small sitting room that served as Bellivo's temporary office's luggage had been placed there the previous evening. The police having sealed and listed its contents, Barrow grumbled but permitted a supervised look. A leather portfolio lay on the table, corded with neat efficiency. Inside were inventories of paintings and obiets, a sheaf of correspondence written in French, and a smaller inner pocket that, when Poirot lifted its flap, revealed a rectangle of unfaded paper and envelope outline left upon the suede by some departed contents. "A letter walked from here," Poirot said. "Not last night. The dust shadow is older, but it walked." Barrow peered. "You can tell it is older. To me it is just a pale patch." Poirot traced with a fingertip the minute gradations at the edge. "The housemaid's cloth visits, but she is respectful. She does not press the corners. A recent removal leaves a wet emptiness. See you the brightness. It is not bright. The color is settled. Days at least." He opened the portfolio's main compartment again, and turned the letters with that deliberate gentleness he gives to things that cannot defend themselves. Bellivo was selling, yes, but he was also soliciting. He needed what? A guarantor, a friend with a salon, His gaze slid, almost lazily, to me. "Think of our Madame Duval. You suspect her still," I blurted. "Suspect?" Poirot said, eyes alight. "I admire. Only the innocent stand so well under the angle of accusation. The guilty have a kink in the neck." He set the papers down and then bent, very suddenly, toward the rug beneath the table. There, half caught in the pile, lay a thread fine, pale, and glistening. He lifted it with a pin. Silk, from a lady's scarf, or from the lining of a gentleman's pocket square. "No, this shade we have already seen. The inside piping of Madame Duval's bag. Observe the faint run of the dye." He placed it on a card. "It means little by itself. It means more with a window, an envelope, a blotter that remembers, and a glass ring that does not dry." Barrow made a sound of exasperation. "We have stains and threads and drafts. Meanwhile, a man is dead. Give me a person I can handcuff." "You shall have one," Poirot said, almost tender. "But if you love the handcuffs, you must woo the motive. We have, thus far, only the manner. We must ask, why Bellivo? And why here? Why the ash on the tongue? Why the letter that went walking?" A knock, soft and harried, interrupted us. It was the head housemaid, cheeks bright from the cold. "Beg pardon, sir, Monsieur Poirot, there is something else." The laundry maid found a cloth in the scullery bin that should not be there, a napkin with the mark. "I thought it from last night, but the corner is stitched with an initial C. The house napkins have no initials, and the mark, well, it will not wash out." Poirot took the folded square she offered with a delicacy that would have suited a relic. Along one corner, in discreet, elegant embroidery, seedy, and on the center, faint but stubborn, a dark smear that had dried to an odd, matte dullness. He did not sniff it. He only looked long enough for silence to develop a shape in the room. "Thank you," he said at last. "This stays with me." When she had gone, he turned the napkin in his hands. "Our secondary mystery blossoms," he said. "A window that pours something away, a blotter that remembers an unsent letter, a portfolio from which something left days ago, and now a cloth that does not wish to be clean." He placed the napkin beside the tiny silk thread. "We are not yet at the poison. We are at the psychology. Someone cleans, someone edits, someone rewrites the Cinepare's coup." The act was careful. The aftermath is hurried. He looked at the mantel clock. 2 hours to 3. "I shall have my tokens then, the small beloved objects, and I think, yes, I think one of them will not come willingly. It will protest by disappearing." "Another theft?" I asked. "A correction," Poirot said. "Our murderer is revising the chapter he has already published." He smiled. "The slightest curve, but the prose leaves its crossings out." Outside, the snowlight eased to a paired blue, the kind that makes a house look more itself. The wind shifted. Somewhere, a door sighed. We gathered our pieces, the glass ring that would not be rubbed away, the silk fragment that remembered a bag, the napkin that kept a name, and returned to the library. There, with the fire propped and Inspector Barrow pacing like a mastiff at a gate, Poirot set his empty notepad before him, and waited for 3 o'clock, as a conductor waits for the orchestra to seat itself, knowing precisely which instrument would squeak and which would come in a bar too soon. Chapter 9. Tokens and Traces. At 3 o'clock the library settled into that particular silence that comes when people agree to humor a man they privately believe has gone too far. Poirot had arranged a small tray upon the desk, lined with a square of white linen. "A parade of intimacies," he called it, with a little bow. "Each of you, if you please, place here the small thing you cherish, and keep near the object that is nothing, and therefore says everything." Inspector Barrow stood at the hearth with folded arms, trying to look as if he had not granted permission for this bit of theatre. I sat to Poirot's right, pencil ready, which was less for note-taking than for the impression that notes were being made. They came one by one. Colonel Rathbone first, a heavy old-fashioned pocket-watch on a chain, its cover engraved with the crest worn soft by years of handling. He placed it with care, as a man sets down loyalty itself. Lifted it, did not open it, only traced the hinge with a fingernail. "A soldier's metronome," he said gently. Time disciplined into obedience. At the hinge, Poirot's nail drew away a speck, dark against the linen. He did not remark it then. Madame Elise Vautrin set down a slim silver locket on a faded ribbon. "My husband's," she said simply. "I wear it when the weather is cold." A tiny click, and the locket opened to reveal a pressed violet, and, beneath it, the corner of a photograph, 2 figures blurred by time. "When things are cold," Elise added, "one keeps near what warms." Poirot looked at her with a respect that gave her back some small part of the dignity the last 24 hours had taken. Edward Latham contributed a fountain pen, black, handsome, and too aggressively polished. "A Parker duofold," he announced, as though that alone were exoneration. Poirot turned it once, twice, then unscrewed the cap with exquisite slowness. The nib flashed. At its base, a faint dull film clung in a crescent. "You clean with care, Monsieur," Poirot murmured, "but not with obsession." Latham half smiled. "A critic cannot afford obsession. It interferes with judgment." "Mais nan," said Poirot. "It creates the illusion of judgment." He replaced the cap. Julian Marchand, with a grin intended to be insolent and succeeding at boyish, offered a silver lighter with a chaste grapevine upon it. He flicked it before placing it down, an unnecessary flourish that drew a little breath of blue flame. "A vice," he said, "but it fills a hand." Poirot sniffed the lighter very lightly. "And a pocket," he added. "One must beware of pockets that learn too many tricks." The lighter had a tiny scorch along one edge, as if it had kissed something bitterer than tobacco. Madame Celeste Duval came with a compact green enamel, discreetly elegant, its hinge a delicate living thing. She placed it as one sets down a promise. Poirot opened it with permission, glanced at the mirror, and for a heartbeat looked not at Celeste's face reflected there but at the monogram engraved inside the lid. CD. The letters matched the embroidery upon the stained napkin now folded in his inner pocket. I saw the quick, inward narrowing of his eyes, and then the expression smoothed away. Harris, the butler, produced a small bone-handled knife, the sort used for opening letters. "My mother's," he said, unexpectedly. "She used it at her shop, haberdashery." He looked almost apologetic. I take no letters that require such a thing. But you keep it, Poirot finished, to remember that hands can be both service and pride. Harris bowed, relieved. Lucien Montclair came last. His empty palm hovered, then withdrew. I did not understand the game, he said. I carry nothing. Poirot's eyebrows rose. Nothing. A host, a collector, a lover of the tangible. Montclair's smile was tight. A gentleman's pockets should not bulge. Ah, but they bulge with invisibles, said Poirot. Keys, for example. Montclair hesitated, then reached inside his jacket and extracted a slender chain with a flat brass fob at its end. The fob bore the engraved number C1. He placed it down with reluctance. Cellar key, he said. There are others, of course. Poirot touched the fob with a fingertip. Of course, he did not lift it. He only looked at Montclair long enough for the man to look away. When the tray was filled, Poirot pushed it an inch, so that the light from the window fell across the objects like a shallow tide. Regard us, he said softly. Already they tell us their biographies. He pointed not with accusation, but with curiosity. The Colonel's watch, a resentful grit at the hinge. You took the air this morning, Colonel, near the beds below the east windows. The snow there receives the soot from the old Stactiny black points. Rathbone's moustache bristled. I walk every morning, Jacques Poirot said. And so your watch remembers for you. His finger drifted. Monsieur Latham's pen, a dryness at the nib that is not ink. Oak tannin, perhaps, from our little lesson. And your pocket handkerchief, he gestured. Latham, flustered, produced it, as a faint ring where a pen was wiped hastily. You wiped last night, too. Nest CEP. When you declared the Lafleur perfectly fine, you wished your words to be clean also. Latham's mouth thinned. Julian's lighter, Poirot went on. Smells faintly not only of petrol, but of something acrid, as from char. You warm your fingers upon small dangers. Julian performed a shrug, all shoulders and no sincerity. He paused at Celeste's compact, smiled, and closed it with a click that sounded like a secret button pressed. Madame's is as immaculate as Madame herself, and yet, pardon, the hinge carries a thread, pale with a run of dye. From his pocket he took the tiny silk filament found in Beliveau's sitting room and held it a breath away from the thread at the hinge. Cousins, he said. Celeste's eyes did not blink. All things in a house are cousins by bedtime, she said. And Montclair's key, Poirot concluded, is clean. To clean, a key lives in a lock. It acquires the patina of its home. This one has been polished recently. Montclair returned his gaze with brittle patience. I cleaned what I respect, Bon, said Poirot. And you respect very much what may be asked to testify. He rang for a lamp, lowered the blinds a trifle, and took up the green Morocco blotter we had found in the blue room. With the pencil I had primed for him, he shaded lightly over the drying paper until pale letters crowded out of the nap. A poor man's magic. Yet it always seemed to me like watching ink, remember. The words came imperfectly, a sentence and then a broken phrase. Cannot be proven. Lucien insists. Consignment must wait. Provenance in question if you do not bring. Poirot stopped, studying the ghost text with narrowed eyes. There is no date, he said, but the hand is recent. The writer uses a long S when tired. Madame Duval, may I trouble you? He laid the blotter before her and, with the politest of smiles, placed a plain sheet upon it. Write, if you please, provenance in question. It is a phrase of art. It will not offend. Barrow made a noise, but Celeste accepted the pen that was offered. Not Latham's. Anne wrote. Her hand was elegant, regular, and nothing like the hand on the blotter. Where the ghost letters trembled, hers did not. Mercy, Poirot said, and the smallest crease appeared beside his mouth. So, the words were written in Madame's room, but not by Madame Beliveau, I exclaimed, before I could stop myself. He wrote to her and thought better of sending it. Perhaps Poirot allowed, or someone wrote in order to be found as Beliveau. His gaze dropped again to the letters. Cannot be proven. Provenance in question. He looked up at Montclair. You will forgive me, monsieur, but sometimes a wine's romance outpaces its birth certificate. Did Beliveau, perhaps, offer a collection whose story how to see? Montclair's cheeks flamed. You impugn my judgment. I test it, Poirot replied, very mild. The bottle of Lafleurit's Jefferson parentage is the sort that inflames auction rooms. If a man doubted that parentage, if he threatened to speak of it cheaply in the right ear, a house of reputation might find itself. Drafty he did not accuse. He suggested whether. The room thinned with tension. Rathbone shifted. Julian smiled too much. Latham, sensing the scent of a story, looked almost hopeful. Elise alone gazed at the fire. Men kill, she said softly. Over the past they cannot change, and the future they cannot afford. No one replied. Poirot's hand, which had been idly toying with the tray's linen edge, stilled. One more little thing, he said. Inspector, the threat letter we received this morning. Allow me. Barrow produced it. Poirot placed it beside Latham's pen and Montclair's key. Our anonymous friend writes with a nib that catches. See the little burr at the end of same. Monsieur Latham's nib shows a faint notch at precisely the angle that would make such a catch. Latham flushed. Puce. You cannot. This is nonsense. Half the pens in London scratch. Exact, Poirot agreed cheerfully, which is why I do not accuse you. But I observe, a critic who soothes with words may also threaten with them, if asked too politely by his vanity. A man whose reputation depends on proximity to greatness sometimes writes for its protection. Who asked him? Barrow demanded. The same someone, Poirot said, who polishes keys and leaves windows open to advertise their innocence. Buttonen, we are not yet at names. We are at ties that bind. He touched, in turn, the compact, the lighter, the pen, the watch, the locket, the key. Bellevaux sought a guarantor, Madame Duval, perhaps, or Montclair himself, to steady a transaction whose provenance trembled. Colonel Rathbone, collector, would have paid handsomely if assured. Monsieur Latham would have praised, and his praise would have bought price. Julian would have brokered, with the quick courage of a young man near money. Harris would have carried the trays and tried not to hear. Each thread crosses in the same tapestry. A rap came at the door. Harris again, colour in his cheeks. Begging pardon, sir, the small matter. Mr. Poirot, Monsieur Montclair's cellar key is here. Montclair snapped, laying his palm protectively over the fob. Harris swallowed. Yes, sir. Only, the second key, the duplicate, cannot be found in its box. The box is open. For a long second, nobody moved. Poirot looked not at Montclair but at the tray, where the clean key's brass caught the firelight. A house of reputation, he said softly, with two doors to the same room. One door shows itself spotless. The other door strolls about invisibly. His eyes lifted. Merci, Harris. We will all, every one, remain precisely where we are. Barrow's hand went to the telephone as if to chain the walls with wire. Poirot, unhurried, drew from his pocket the monogrammed napkin and laid it beside Celeste's compact, so that CD spoke to CD. Nothing is proven, he said, almost to himself, echoing the ghost script on the blotter. Not yet, but the connections are no longer shy. They step out, they wave. He closed the blotter and, with a glance that was half instruction and half reassurance, said to me, Hastings, we will take a little walk to the cellar, with its doors that are twins who pretend not to know each other. He looked around the room, and for the first time since the dinner his voice took on steel. No one leaves. We are, for the moment, a family. As we went out, the house felt tighter, as if it had drawn in its ribs. Somewhere, faint through the snow-muffled air, a bell sounded from the servants' corridor to quick notes, like a question asked twice. Poirot's step did not falter. The past and the future, Hastings, he said. Between them, a little glass that tasted like ash. Let us see which door taught it that language. Chapter 10. The cellar with two doors. We descended by the narrower stair. The one servants prefer because it is honest about being cold. Harris went ahead with a lamp. The flame threw a small, steady circle that made the stone steps look older than Rome. The air changed as we dropped out, then cooler, then that particular hush that belongs to places where things are kept asleep. At the foot, two doors faced one another across a short passage like wary brothers. The left was the handsome one, oak-faced, brassed. The fob C1 clearly its mate. The right war paint and humility. Its keyhole had a thin collar of iron that had known more scrubbing than polish. Between them, a small table bore a register book and a stub of pencil tied on string. Harris set the lamp down and waited, hands respectfully still. Poirot did not go at once to the proud door. He studied the floor flagstones, fine with dust that servants cannot reach without offending their master's sense of patina. No footprints, I said. Only yours now, Harris. Just so, murmured Poirot. And yet consider the dust here, where the skirting dips. It has been brushed with a cloth, lightly. A housemaid's hand would work in lines. This is a circular caress. He looked up with a small smile. Someone who wished the idea of dust to remain, Hastings, but not its truth. Harris produced a ring from his pocket and offered the brass fob key. If you please, sir. Montclair had not liked surrendering it in the library. The butler had liked even less carrying it here under our eyes. Poirot shook his head. "No, we will begin with the poor relation." He nodded at the painted door. "Who keeps this key?" "The duplicate is kept in a little oak box in Monsieur Montclair's study," Harris said, and then coloured as he remembered. The box was open. The key, absent. Poirot bent to the iron collar. "Graphite," he said mildly, touching his forefinger to the keyhole and showing us a faint shine. "Fresh. It is good for a lock that sticks. It also conceals a lock that has been made to speak." He placed his ear to the panel and tapped once with a knuckle. "Hollow past 6 inches, then stone." He straightened. "Open it, if you will." Harris hesitated. "Without the keys," Poirot said, "are honest most of the time. But locks had their flirtations." From his waistcoat he produced a small bit of bent wire, ridiculous thing to see and so fastidious. A hand in 2 patient turns. The latch yielded. With an embarrassed click, Barrow would have approved of the result and disapproved of the method. Fortunately, Barrow was not there. The door gave onto a narrow slip of corridor, and, beyond it, the cellar proper, a ribbed nave of stone with ranks of bottles lying in their bunks like soldiers who had grown into their beds. The air was cool enough to discourage speech. Harris lifted the lamp higher. The shadows dutifully retreated. "Your register, Harris." Poirot took the pencil, turned the book. Entries in neat house script marched back months. Bordeaux, 1899. 1 case opened for private. Sauternes 3 bottles to supper room. And then, more recent, Le Fleur, 1787. Removed to pantry. 7:15. The hand was Harris's. No entry for the second door, Poirot said. Harris shook his head. "It is not used, sir. It opens to the garden passage to the old delivery stairs. Master prefers the oak door for guests." "Mais oui," Poirot said. "But thieves prefer what is not preferred." He moved down the first aisle without touching, merely letting his eye read the labels, as a barrister reads a jury. He stopped at a rack where a sleeping tear held a vacancy. No bottle now. Only the shallow crescent of dust that bottles leave when they have been present long enough to teach the shelf their shape. On the stone beneath, directly below the empty slot, lay 2 small glints. He lowered himself with that curious neatness of his, and teased them up with a fingernail. One, a brittle crescent of blackened wax. The other, a clear shard that caught the light like a sliver of ice. "Tartaric," he said, holding the clear shard to the lamp. "A tiny crystal fallen from a corked mouth when a bottle is tilted, and the wax old but scorched recently." "Scorched," I echoed. He smiled sideways. "How do we warm a stubborn capsule, Hastings, when we wish the foil to yield quickly to a hand not practiced? With a flame, a lighter, perhaps, one with a little kiss of char along its edge." He did not speak the name, but I saw the shadow of Julian's grapevine lighter flicker in his eyes. We went on. At the end of the row, the stone turned damp where the outer stairs met the wall. Here, a small square of glass had been cut at head height long ago to admit a miser's light. Now it was furred with winter. Beneath it, on the sill, lay a pinch of the same black grit we had seen beneath the blue room window. Poirot touched it, then rubbed forefinger to thumb and sniffed. "Not soot, not earth. Char," he said softly. "Oak char. It lives in many cellars used to dress an impatient wine. It leaves the palate with a memory of ash." He did not look triumphant. His expression, if anything, grew grave. "It is not poison, mon ami," he said, anticipating my next thought. "Char does not kill, but it teaches a vocabulary to the tongue so that when the murderer needed the ash to be there, it would not be questioned." I stared. "Then last night someone prepped the guests. Somebody prepped the idea, which is all a palate-easer set of ideas the mouth believes." He turned the register so the lamp showed a faint smudge at the bottom corner, then pressed the nap with a square of linen. When he lifted it, there was a ghost print, the barest suggestion of a fingerprint where a thumb had steadied the page. He folded the linen as if it had become a document, and put it away. "Perhaps nothing," he said. "Perhaps only Harris writing with cold hands. I collected as I cannot collect it later." The center of the cellar, a small table held utensils, a waiter's friend, a delicate brush for dusting labels, a candle set in a bottleneck, one of those old, theatrical things used to show a cork its duty. Poirot's hand hovered and declined to touch. "Look," he murmured. "The wax of the candle lip is soft along one side only. It has been laid near a draught." He turned. A thin seam of air played along the base of the painted door. It was not much, but it was steady. "The poor relation breathes," meaning I ventured. Someone has used it often enough to wear the weather strip. Meaning, said Poirot, someone opened it long enough last night for a warmer current to break the cellar's careful temperature. The wine would notice, if a man did not. He pointed with a delicate forefinger to a thermometer fixed on a pillar. See the bubble, it climbs half a degree above the chalk mark Harris keeps, and here he tapped the chalked note, 9 o'clock, to 10, and above it, a second. Fainter line rubbed and written again. A correction, a conscience in chalk. Harris looked wounded to be suspected of untidiness. I mark the hour every evening. Sir, you do, Poirot said kindly, and you corrected yourself when the bubble betrayed you. Do not distress yourself. The fault is not yours. The drama is being played around you. We returned to the proud door. Its lock turned with the well-oiled self-respect of a gentleman who knows he is being watched. Inside, immediately to the left, lay a small table draped in green baize, the altar at which Montclair performed his private rites. A shallow silver bowl sat upon it, and next to that a folded square of linen finer than any in the sky. Poirot lifted the bowl at its lip. The faintest grey shadow clung. He did not rub it. He looked only long enough to know it would be there when needed. The altar, he said softly, where the host decants, where he polishes the story, where he rehearses the pour. He set the bowl back exactly as it had been, and yet last night he poured from the bottle, not the I groped in memory. He said the lip of the glass showed only the cork's abrasion. Just so. Then why was the decanter on the table with wine in it before he opened the bottle? He watched my face as I tried to reconcile my own impressions, the dark contents catching candlelight, Montclair's flourish with the corkscrew, the glasses filled. The contradiction, he murmured, is the small hinge upon which large doors swing. He stooped suddenly and plucked from the baize a short, stiff, and blue-grey boar bristle, he said. From a label brush, someone brushed a label in haste. The bristle broke and stayed. He looked at the nearest bin. The bottles lay uniform as soldiers on inspections, Fave 1, whose label showed the barest arc of a smear under its printed date, as if a thumb had at first pressed too hard, and then thought better of it. You see how the little grey cells are pleased, he told me. And there was, for a flicker, a boy's delight in his voice. It vanished at once. But we do not play with our pleasures while a man is dead. One more thing. At the far end, half hidden by a crate, stood a wooden stool. Upon it lay a scrap of paper torn from a ledger margin, folded twice. Poirot opened it. 4 numbers were penciled there, aligned like soldiers' boots. 715 to 719, 2803 to 2810. He considered them, then smiled a smile that wanted no audience. He folded the scrap and slipped it into his pocket. What are they? I demanded. Times, he said. But who's that? Hastings. I will keep for 1 minute to myself. He tapped his temple. A clue is a shy bird. If you show it too soon, it flies to the wrong shoulder. We came up by the proud stair into a corridor that had warmed while we were below. Barrow was waiting at the turn with the stance of a man who expects handcuffs to bloom from thin air if he looks sternly enough. Well, he barked. Poirot's face was amiable. We have learned that your pantry has a cousin with a taste for draughts, that oak has a memory like ash, and that candles tell stories when set too near a door. Barrow made a grimace that in another man would have been a laugh. In plain English, said Poirot, someone rehearsed the taste of the crime before they committed the crime, and someone else, or the same someone, improved the scene after. Using a door that pretends to be unused, he patted the inspector's sleeve. And we have the first thing that does not match the story our host told us. A little contradiction. I will test at once. He looked at me. Hastings, we will ask Monsieur Montclair, very politely, to show us his decanter. Again, Barrow groaned. Mais oui, said Poirot, brightness contained behind courtesy. For I believe our decanter will say something very simple and very dangerous. That it was used yesterday before. Last night by a hand that could not bear to wait for an audience. He began to walk, then paused as if remembering a trifle, and turned back to the register. With the pencil tied on string he drew a tiny dot beside the entry Lafleur, 1787 removed to pantry, 715. It was nothing less than nothing, but he looked at it with affection, as a chess player looks at a pawn that has just stepped onto its final square. A very small thing, he said, almost to the stone. But now, Hastings, the board is set for the next move. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. The library was warmer than the cellar. but the air inside felt no less cold. The suspects were still there. As Poirot had instructed before, our decenterade like pieces set back in place after a pause in play. Some sat, some stood. All looked as though the time had worn their patience thin. Colonel Rathbone stood stiffly near the mantel, his watch chain taut between his waistcoat buttons. Julian lounged in an armchair, one leg over the other, flipping his lighter open and shut in a restless tattoo. Elise Vautrin occupied a low seat near the fire, her hands folded around her locket as though it were a talisman against the company she kept. Celeste Duval reclined with unshakable poise, her compact resting on the arm of her chair like an ornament in a shop window. Latham was pacing between shelves, his hands clasped behind him. Montclair remained near the drinks trolley, turning a small glass of brandy without drinking it. Poirot entered with his usual air of composure, as if descending from the cellar were no different from arriving at a luncheon. "Miss Amos," he began, "I thank you for your patience. The cellar has been most instructive. Instructive, too, is the manner in which time passes differently for each of us when we wait. Some of you are restless, some are still, some conceal their impatience in little games." His eyes flickered toward Julian's lighter. "It is always in the little games that the truth peeks out." Julian snapped the lighter shut and set it on the armrest with an exaggerated flourish. "If you've found the killer, Poirot, why not say so and be done?" "Because," mon cher Poirot replied, "I have not yet decided which of you is the killer, but I am much nearer to knowing who is not." He moved to the decanter sitting in pride of place on the sideboard, a graceful, bell-shaped vessel of cut crystal. "Monsieur Montclair, may I trouble you to confirm, this is your decanter?" Montclair's jaw tightened. "It is." Poirot lifted it, holding it to the light. "It has been polished, yes, but not recently. There is dust in the groove of the stopper. Yet," he turned it slightly, "there is a film inside the neck, a faint tide mark where liquid rested before it was poured away. This is not the ghost of last night's Lafleur. It is older. Something stood in this vessel yesterday morning, or perhaps the evening before, and then was removed." Montclair's voice was low but edged. "You accuse me of what? Decanting a bottle in advance. That is hardly a crime." "No," Poirot said softly, "but it is a contradiction. For last night you poured directly from the bottle, with great ceremony, as if no decanter were needed. If the decanter was used at all, why not in view of your guests? Unless," and here he let the pause breathe, "unless the decanter had been used for something you did not wish them to see." The effect was immediate. Latham stopped pacing. Rathbone's gaze shifted, sharp, toward Montclair. Julian leaned forward, interest undisguised. Elise looked down, her fingers tightening around her locket. Celeste did not move, but her eyes had narrowed just enough to catch Poirot's notice. Montclair set down his glass of brandy with a faint clink. "You read too much into housekeeping details, Monsieur Poirot." Perhaps Poirot agreed, but housekeeping is the art of knowing where things belong, and murder is the art of moving them. Before Montclair could respond, Rathbone spoke, his voice tight. If Montclair decanted early, he could have added anything he liked to Bellevaux's glass. "We're all thinking it." "That's convenient for you, Colonel," Julian said lazily. "You've been waiting for someone to say it." Rathbone's moustache bristled. "I speak plainly. You prefer insinuation." "Gentlemen," Celeste said, her voice smooth as lacquer, "please. It is so tedious to hear two men pretend they are defending truth when they are only defending themselves. And you," Madame Latham cut in, "are rather quiet for someone whose room appears to have been the scene of, what shall we call it, disposal?" Celeste's smile was a fraction colder. "We shall call it what it is, a clumsy attempt to make me appear guilty. I have no need to pour wine out of windows. I simply refuse to drink it." "Refuse to drink it because you knew what was in it," Rathbone said sharply. Elise's voice, quiet but steady, threaded through the clash. "Perhaps we all knew something, but knowing and doing are not the same, and sometimes the one who shouts loudest is only trying to be heard over their own conscience." For a moment, the room was a series of locked gazes, no two meeting without suspicion sparking between them. Poirot let the silence linger until it felt like a held breath. Then, gently he said, "You see, Inspector Barrow, how the current runs when the tide is low. Already the alliances shift. Already the blame looks for a home." Barrow, who had been leaning against the desk with arms folded, pushed off. "I don't care for games, Poirot. If you've got something, give it to me. If not, I'll start sorting them the old-fashioned way." Poirot inclined his head. The old-fashioned way will not work here. This crime is not in the fingerprints, but in the timings. It is the minutes that matter for minutes here, 2 minutes there. The cellar register shows the Lafleur removed to the pantry at 7:15. It was served after the oysters, between 7:50 and 8 o'clock by most accounts. In that gap, the bottle had its adventures, and some of those adventures were not in the pantry at all. His gaze moved deliberately from Julian to Montclair to Celeste. The second cellar, Duritsky gone, a draught under the sill, oak char in the outer passage, the same char that would make the wine taste like ash to all who drank it so. No one would notice if Belivo's glass carried more than its share of bitterness. Julian's lighter made a soft clink as it tipped against the chair arm. Celeste's fingers closed over her compact. Montclair's hand returned to his glass, though he did not drink. Poirot continued, "What fascinates me is not merely who could have done these things, but who would have taken the trouble to arrange the scene afterward. The open window in Madame Duval's room, the stain on the sill, the napkin marked with her initials, it is a little too artful, and when art is too obvious, Hastings, it is no longer truth. It is theatre." Rathbone gave a short, humorless laugh. "So you think the killer is someone who enjoys a bit of stagecraft?" Poirot's moustache twitched. "Perhaps, or someone who understands that when you wish to hide, you must sometimes step into the spotlight if only for a moment." The tension had wound so tightly that even the sound of the clock on the mantel seemed too loud. Then Harris entered, hesitant. "Beg pardon, sir, the groundskeeper just brought this in. Found it under the hedge by the east wall. Thought you might want to see." In his hand was a small, crumpled paper twist, no bigger than a man's thumb, tied at the end with a shred of linen thread. Poirot took it delicately, loosened the tie, and tipped a faint dusting of grey-black powder into his palm. He bent to it, and the scent reached me even where I stood. Bitter, woody, unmistakably burnt. "Oak char," Poirot said softly. From the cellar's outer passage, dropped, perhaps, in haste, he let the powder trickle back into the twist, then held it up for all to see. "It is a little thing, but little things tell the story, if you know the language." He turned to Barrow. "Inspector, I suggest no one leaves this house tonight. The murderer has tried twice now to misdirect us. The third attempt, I think, will be the last stand. I intend to be there when it comes." A murmur rippled through the room, half defiance, half unease. Poirot met each gaze in turn, the faintest smile touching his lips. "Yes, mise à mise. The play is not over, and in the next act, the curtain will rise on something none of you expect." Chapter 12. The confrontation. Poirot announced, with the air of a motor D proposing sorbet, that the house must enjoy a brief interval before dinner, an hour to breathe, to dress, to telephone one's solicitor, should one fancy it. Inspector Barrow grumbled over the loosened leash, but Poirot prevailed with a small bow and the promise that the servants would watch the corridors as if each were a border crossing. The guests dispersed in twos and ones, their silence rustling like paper. When the library had thinned, Poirot said quite lightly, "Hastings, will you be so amiable as to occupy the inspector with an account of your regiment's winter rations? You will discover that statistics soothe him." He turned, as if by coincidence, to where Julian was lingering with his lighter, coaxing a nervous flame. "Monsieur Marsh, we will take a constitutional in the conservatory. It is good for the skin. It reveals the character." Julian's grin had edges. "If this is another lecture on arithmetic, I'd prefer the gallows." Yet he came, flicking the lighter shut, pocketing it with the gesture of a man who cannot resist the last word, even in mime. The conservatory was a long, glass-lidded tunnel grafted to the house's south flank. Its palms and ferns made winter tender by small iron stoves that ticked as they cooled. Snowlight pressed its face to the panes. Beyond it, the garden was a pale map punctured by black hedges. Poirot chose a bench half in shade, half in the washed-out brightness that winter calls daylight. He sat as if for a portrait, neat at every seam. "You do not like to wait, Monsieur Julian," he observed, with no reproach. "Waiting is a form of obedience, and you do not enjoy obedience." Julian slouched opposite, the posture of youth performing contempt with artistry. "I obey when it profits me." "Bean, sir." Poirot folded his hands. "Profit has many shapes. There is money, which is loud. There is reputation, which is quiet but dear. And there is control, which is oxygen to some men, which, for you—" Julian's smile thinned. "You want me to say money, so that the colonel can bristle and my uncle can sigh? Very well. I collect it. I even arrange for other people to collect it." when I am in the mood. Ah, Poirot said, an arranger. He let the word linger. An arranger notices the mechanics. Who stands where, who has a key, which door will squeak if opened. He notices also how long a thing takes. 4 minutes to go down the poor stair, to too warm a stubborn capsule. 1 to come up again. Julian's eyes flickered, a betraying ripple over still water. Is that your poetry, or your case? It is only time, mon cher Poirot watched a frond shiver, then settle. You see, last night, time was the murder's accomplice. Between 7:15 and 8, the bottle had its adventures. As I told the inspector, what I did not say in the library is this. Somebody wrote down the adventures in numbers. 4 little soldiers in pencil. Such men exist. They cannot do a wrong thing without counting it first. Julien's laugh was careless and just shy of natural. If you found a list, you should read it to yourself. Lists are private. It is private to me, Poirot agreed, for the present, and yet his voice turned conversational. Almost bored. The first figure is 7:15, that we know from the register. So if a man were to tell me now, for instance, that he was upstairs at 7:19, I should be charmed. It was so quick I might have missed it had I not known Poirot was hunting for it. The breath caught, the pupils a fraction tight, the head half turned to listen to a sentence he had himself spoken. Then Julian delivered the mistake with admirable speed, hoping to make it look deliberate. "Archesecci disnovi," he said, languidly. "I was upstairs. Ask Harris. I fetched my—" He stopped, for the sentence had reached the cliff he had not seen. Poirot did not smile. "Votre he prompted softly. "Your watch tells you the minutes so tenderly." Julian's color rose and vanished. "All London eats by the minute, Monsieur Poirot." "Just so," Poirot murmured. "But only one man in this house has heard the minutes 7:19 today. He heard it in the cellar, where it was written on a small torn paper, and he put that minute in his pocket like a coin. Shall I tell you how I know you are that man? It is not the courage of your chin, though, that is interesting. No, it is the lighter." Julian's hand moved, then stilled. "You have a taste for the small flame," Poirot said, not unkindly. "You warm a capsule when patience is thin. Your lighter carries along its edge a kiss of char. Your cuff this morning had a dust like black sugar. In the outer passage, under the old delivery window, the oak char sits like pepper on snow. And in the cellar itself, where one bottle's wax remembers a flame, the air is marked by a draught from the poor door that you prefer, because a boy prefers what is not allowed. You see why I wished to walk here and not speak in the library. I do not yet say that you are a killer. I say only that you are an arranger who has walked everywhere the arrangement required." Julian's eyes had cooled to their best steel. "You think this little exercise frightened me into a confession. Keep it. I tell you again, I was upstairs at 7:19. Poirot regarded him a moment, then inclined his head as if to a violinist who has played a difficult passage without beauty. "Very well, we leave it with the snow. But one more note, set down for the sheet. You are quick to admit small guilt to protect large innocence. You would rather be seen as a mischievous boy in a cellar than as a man who plans." Julian stood abruptly. "It must be very dull to think of nothing but plans." "To the contrary," Poirot said. "It is the great romance." Julian's mouth twitched despite himself. He half bowed, half sneered, and left his shoes loud on the tiles, the door to the house taking him back like a mouth swallowing a sweet. Poirot remained seated until the conservatory was only glass and the mild kettle music of cooling stoves. Then he arose, smoothed his sleeve, and spoke without turning his head. "You have heard enough, Inspector." Barrow stepped out from behind the stand of citrus, where he had been posted, large as a gardener's nightmare. He looked both satisfied and offended. "He gave you the time." "I heard it." "What devil's trick was that?" "No trick," Poirot said. "Only a fact that wished to be touched." His eyes warmed, briefly. "Mercy for allowing me my little theatre." Barrow blew out a breath. "It puts Marchand at the cellar at the critical moments. We can hold him, you can keep him in the house," Poirot corrected. "We have not yet tied the manner to the motive, and there remains the thing that kills. Oak char offends the tongue. It does not silence a man's heart." "Then what did—" Barrow demanded. Poirot shook his head gently. "You will permit the little grey cells their dessert." He moved to the glass, peered out at the white beds. "Our murderer is intelligent, but impatient. He rehearsed the taste before the act. He revised the scene after. He needed a man like Latham to say perfectly fine, and a woman like Madame Duval to look like a villain. He needed Montclair's pride, which would insist upon a flourish, and Harris's punctuality, which would not notice for minutes gone. Barrows snorted. He, you say he, I say he when I speak of the plan. Poirot replied, the pronoun belongs to the vanity, not the body. We returned along the corridor, and as we turned into the main hall we met Elise Vautrin coming from the stairs, her cloak about her shoulders as if the house were colder than before. She paused, searching Poirot's face. Things break, she said quietly, apropos of nothing, and then men sweep. But the dust remembers where the vase stood, Madame Poirot said, bowing with feeling. You have the soul of a curator. In the library again, the temperature of the room changed the moment Julian re-entered from the opposite door. Celeste's glance travelled to him, and away like a moth testing a lamp. Rathbone's jaw settled into stubborn lines. Montclair had returned to his brandy, but not yet to appetite. Latham hovered beside the decanter, as if it might suddenly propose an interview. Poirot took his old position by the sideboard. I have had a conversation, he announced, as if one had not heard the echo of it along the corridor. It has given me the one thing I lacked, an error. He let his gaze rest on Julian just long enough for the young man to look an inch to the left of it. In a case like this, error is better than proof. Proof tells you what happened. Error tells you who could not bear for it to be discovered. Julian attempted levity and achieved mockery. Shall we toast to the error? There is still brandy. Later, Poirot said. First, a little experiment. He asked Harris for the tray with the 3 identical glasses, the young Bordeaux, the table wine, the oak Tisanthos, props from the morning's lesson. We will change the order. Monsieur Latham, will you indulge me once more? Latham grimaced publicly, but he stepped up with all the inward vanity of a man certain he will redeem a failed performance. He named 2 correctly and stumbled on the 3rd. The room gave a small, mean sigh. Poirot looked at no one, only at the 3rd glass. You see, he said mildly, how easy it is to be wrong, and yet to be certain. Last night required such certainty. The murderer gambled that certainty would do his work for him, that all would taste ash, and so none would taste the thing he used. The thing, Montclair burst out, unable to keep from the center of his own tragedy. What is this thing? You speak in smoke. I speak in the language of the palate, Poirot returned. And that language is learning new words, monsieur. It will name them when it is ready. For now, he laid down the 3rd glass. I will tell you something else instead. Someone in this room has the duplicate cellar key in his possession. He took it from the box, and he will not return it, because it has told him he is clever. He has hidden it where clever men hide their guilt, among the objects they believe define them. His eyes travelled the tray where, earlier, the tokens had sat, the watch, the locket, the pen, the lighter, the compact, the key. We will search in plain sight, he said softly, and when we find the key, we will have not the end but the beginning of the end. A movement, then the smallest, like a flinch of a heartbeat under a fine shirt. It was enough for Poirot. He did not pounce. He did not even change his tone. He simply inclined his head the merest fraction toward the chair where the silver lighter lay, idle and decorative as a pet asleep. After dinner, he said, I will ask you all for one last favor, a reconstruction perhaps, a minute here, a seat there. By midnight, Mies Amos, it will be finished. The clock on the mantel gave 2 deliberate strokes. Outside, the snow refused to melt. Inside, the room creaked once as if remembering it had a spine, and in the very center of the stillness, the error that had betrayed itself continued to breathe, soft and pleased and aware that Poirot had already trimmed the wick. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape dinner was a tense affair. The long table, which only the night before had been the stage for ceremony, now seemed narrower, as though suspicion had drawn its edges inward. Conversation was sparse. Cutlery sounded too sharply against china. Montclair presided without flourish, his face set in the brittle courtesy of a host who has lost command of his own house. Poirot ate little, speaking less, and I could see that his mind was already arranging the final act he had promised. The seating was a mirror of the fatal evening. At Poirot's insistence, Julian lounged 2 seats to Montclair's left, Celeste directly opposite, Rathbone beside her. Elise Vautrin was again midway down, with Latham across from her. Harris moved silently between us, but his eyes missed nothing, glancing often toward Poirot, as though awaiting a signal. Halfway through the main course, the air shifted. It was nothing visible, just a tightening, a subtle current under the surface. Poirot noticed it too. I saw his head incline slightly, his fork set down without a sound. Celeste's gaze, languid all evening, had sharpened toward Julian. He, in turn, kept his eyes on his plate, his lighter absent from its habitual fidget. Dessert was served, a simple dish of poached pears. Montclair rose with the air of a man determined to reclaim some authority. "I suggest," he began, "that after we have eaten, we all proceed to the library for whatever it is Monsieur Poirot intends." That was when it happened. Harris had just set a dish before Celeste, when there was the faintest clatter behind me. I turned in time to see Julian's chair shift back not far, but enough for him to slide a hand into his jacket. Then, as Harris moved to pour coffee, Julian's body angled toward the sideboard. In one motion too fluid for accident, he slipped something into his palm, rose, and started for the door. "Where are you going, Monsieur Marchand?" Poirot's voice was quiet, almost courteous, but it cut through the low murmur of the room. Julian didn't stop. "A cigarette," he said over his shoulder. "Unless your rules forbid breathing too." Barrow was already on his feet. "Sit down, Marchand." But Julian's pace quickened. He reached the door, pulled it open and found Harris there, broad and unyielding, the coffee tray now abandoned on a nearby table. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Julian stepped back, his eyes darting to the other exeter, one leading through the small anteroom to the servants' passage. "Nan," Poirot said, and though he had not raised his voice, it held such precision that it froze the moment. "You will not take the key from this house, monsieur." Every head turned. Julian's smile was quick and thin. "What key?" "The duplicate to the poor cellar door," Poirot replied. "The one missing from the oak box in Monsieur Montclair's study. You keep it not because you wish to use it again, but because you think possession of it protects you, that without it, I cannot prove you were in the cellar at the exact times marked on your little list." "I have no list," Julian said sharply. "Maze, you have one in your memory, if nowhere else. 7:15, 7:19, 8:03, 8:10. The minutes when the door was opened, when the capsule was warmed, when the char was taken from the outer passage, when the bottle was returned. But now, you think to rid yourself of the key before I can show that its scratches match the lock you favored." Julian laughed too loud, too quickly. "If I had it, why would I be fool enough to carry it to dinner?" "Because," Poirot said, "you feared the search would be in your room next. You feared I would ask for your token again, the lighter, the object you cannot keep from your pocket, and that this time I would find the key hidden inside its hollow petrol chamber." There was a stillness then, sharp and sudden, like the moment before a storm breaks. Julian's eyes flicked once to his lighter, resting on the sideboard where he had set it down before the meal. That flick was all Barrow needed. In 2 strides he had it in his hand. He unscrewed the base with surprising deftness, and there it was. A small brass key, no fob, faint scratches along its edge. Barrow held it up. "Looks like we've got you, lad." Julian's face was unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the truth. This was no longer about pretense. "You're making a mistake," he said, but there was less heat in it now. "A key proves nothing. Anyone could—" "Ah," Poirot interrupted, "but it does prove something. It proves you are the one person in this room who cannot claim never to have opened that door. And when I tell you, before all, that the poor door is the true stage of our drama, that it is there the ash was prepared to teach our palates what to expect, you will see how very narrow your corner has become." Celeste spoke then, her voice quiet but cutting. "If you arrange the stage, Julian, then you are not the actor. You are the stagehand. Someone else played the part." Julian's reply was a shrug, but it was the shrug of a man who knows the current has turned against him. "Think what you like." Poirot's gaze softened oddly. "I do not think, monsieur. I know. But whether you are the hand that placed the char in the wine, or the hand that fetched it for another, that is the question for which I still require an answer. And before the night is out, I shall have it." Barrow stepped forward. "He's not leaving my sight." "Just so," Poirot agreed. "But do not lock him away, not yet. Let him remain here, in the company of those he sought to misdirect. The murderer will feel the net tighten. The next move will be taken in haste. And in haste, my friends, lie the sweetest errors." Julian sat again, the picture of bored defiance, but his eyes no longer wandered the room. They stayed fixed on a point just beyond Poirot's shoulder, as if he were already plotting the line of escape he would never have the chance to take. For his part, returned to his seat, lifting his spoon to the pair before him with almost comical delicacy. "Let us finish dessert, mes amis," he said. The drama, it is always best served on a full stomach. I could feel it then, as surely as the warmth from the fire a change in the air. Someone at that table was recalculating, abandoning one plan and shaping another. The confrontation had shifted the balance, but the game was not yet won, not while the true hand behind Beliveau's death remained hidden, and from the gleam in Poirot's eyes, I knew he was ready to draw that hand into the open for the clock struck midnight. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place when desert had been cleared and the coffee cooled to a film. Poirot rose with that mild, courteous finality which always makes a room obey before it has decided to do so. "Mies Amos," he said, "we will make a little promenade into yesterday. It is not the grand denouement, Nan, that is for a later hour, but a rehearsal. We will sit as we sat. We will pour as we poured. We will let the minutes walk their old path." Inspector Barrow gave a grunt that might have been assent. Harris, already alert to some unspoken program, opened the dining room doors. The long table had been reset. The white cloth shone with a starch that looked almost moral. Place cards waited where they had waited before. The room itself seemed to remember. Poirot placed us exactly. Montclair at the head, the decanter upon the sideboard, the spare glasses ranged like recruits. Julian 2 seats to the left, Celeste opposite him, her compact steady as a lookout's glass, Rathbone beside her, chin set, Elise midway down, hands folded, Latham pacing until Poirot, with a single look, anchored him to his chair. I took my old position. Harris stood like a pillar at the door. "Now," Poirot said cheerfully, "we will pour exactement as last night. Monsieur Montclair, if you please." Montclair reached for the bottle of water, tonight, and unstoppered it, with the same flourish he had given the cork. His hand, I noticed, was beautiful at the task, precise, proud, at home. He filled the first glass nearest to him, Beliveau's vacant place, and, turning left, extended his arm to me, then further down toward Elise. He turned back, crossed his body to Celeste's side, then on to Rathbone, and finally down to Julian. He set the bottle down with a quiet click and waited, eyes bright with injured dignity. "TRS Bean," Poirot said, "and now once more. But this time do not think of us at all. Think only of what your hand remembers." A faint impatience tightened Montclair's mouth. He took up the bottle again, and this time did not look. He filled Beliveau's glass first without hesitation, as before, and then, without turning his head, swung his arm to his left. The movement, executed blind, faltered an inch at the elbow, as if memory had encountered an obstacle where none stood. He corrected, poured mine, and went on. "Merci," Poirot murmured. His eyes had narrowed with the pleasure of a man hearing a theme reprise. Again, but slower. A third time. Beliveau's glass, a sweep left. The fractional check, like a dancer avoiding a mark. Barrow frowned. "What am I meant to see?" Poirot's voice was gentle. "Only that last night, when Monsieur Montclair poured, there was a reason he did not pour straight down his left-hand line. Something sat in the way, and not a person. Something he did not wish to jostle." Rathbone's moustache lifted. "A decanter." "A decanter." "Nan," said Poirot softly. A glass. He touched the rim of the goblet before Elise's place, prepared before the bottle reached the table, prepared with such nicety that the host's hand learned to avoid it, even while his mind told him there was nothing there to avoid. He turned to Montclair. "You are a man of arrangements. Your body remembers them." Montclair's color rose. "This is childish." "Childhood," Poirot said pleasantly, "is where habits are honest." He nodded to Harris. "The lamps, if you please, a little lower." Under the softened light, the tablecloth seemed to whiten. Poirot produced from his pocket a small oblong of glass the cover Barrow had fetched earlier to preserve the stain on the blue room sill, and laid it upon the cloth where Elise's water-glass stood. He slid the glass an inch across the pane. A faint, almost invisible crescent appeared on the glass plate, an arc of residue you would not see, unless you expected it. "The rim leaves a ghost. Hastings," he said to me, as the blotter remembers a sentence, "the glass that was prepared last night left its ghost also upon a service plate removed before coffee. Harris, the scullery maid, set it aside. She is tidy in her untidiness. I collected it an hour ago." He tapped the oblong. A grey kiss shimmered where the light caught it. "A ring too stubborn to wash. A ring that answers to the stain on Madame Duval's window and to the smear upon the monogrammed napkin. But the napkin, it does not belong to Madame. It belongs to a man who needed her initials. Celeste's chin lifted a fractional degree. At last, she said, not without gratitude. Poirot inclined his head to her, then turned, almost idly, to the sideboard where 3 clean goblets waited. "We will do another little trick," he announced. "Harris, a lemon from the pantry." "Colonel, if you please, the salt," Barrow muttered. "If you make a cocktail of this investigation, Poirot, patience," Poirot said, eyes alight. He rubbed the cut lemon on the first glass's rim. He salted the second. The third he left untouched. Then he set them out. "Taste only with your finger," he instructed, "and tell us which is which." We obeyed, with murmurs. Even Latham, cowed by the morning's failure, identified them correctly. Bon Poirot said, "Now this is not lemon, not salt." From his pocket he produced the small paper twist, found under the east hedge. He did not open it. A very fine char from oak, such as lives in old cellars and eager minds. "If I rub it on a rim, what do I make?" "A memory," Elise said softly. "Exact." Poirot smiled. "A memory the tongue will obey. Now imagine another powder, colorless, tasteless at first touch, that kills in minutes when it meets its friend in a glass. Imagine it is applied not to the wine, but to the rim. Under a veil of ash the palate expects. What have you?" "A single prepared glass," Rathbone said, voice low, "and a room of witnesses who will swear the wine itself was to blame." Poirot's eyes warmed. "You have it, Colonel." He looked past us to Montclair, who had not moved. "You see why the decanter mattered, monsieur. Not because it held poison, it did not, but because it shows you handled ceremony before the audience arrived. You rehearsed. You set the table as a stage. A prepared rim can be placed while the servants lay napery. A smear can be made to look like the stain of age. A window can be opened to give the stain an alibi. All this, avant la donnée. But still you required one thing you could not control, where Bellevue would sit." Montclair's laugh was short. "The host controls his table." "Ah," Poirot said softly, "but the place cards were not written by you." He let the sentence hang, then added, almost tenderly, "They were written by Madame Vautrin." Every face turned. Elise did not flinch. "Yes," she said. "Harris asked me. The housemaid is young. Her hand shakes on a flourish." Her eyes met Poirot's. "I set Bellevue where Monsieur Montclair told me to set him. And here," Poirot said, tapping the cloth before Elise, "is the small hinge. The glass that was prepared sat by your hand while you wrote the names. The smear upon the service plate I found bears, at its edge, a striation made by a nib. It brushed a card before it dried. Harris will tell you that when he cleared after oysters, he took a place card from this setting to the sideboard, because the ink had smudged. Did you not, Harris?" Harris, taken aback to be suddenly called, swallowed. "Ah yes, sir. I set it aside to dry, voila," Poirot said softly. The murderer, impatient, laid the rim too soon, and the glass kissed the wet card. His hand corrected, shifted the card. Harris rescued the smudge without knowing he preserved the proof. "That is why. Just now." Monsieur Montclair's arm stuttered in memory. "The body remembers the too delicate thing it nearly disturbed." Barrow blew out a breath. "It puts the work before dinner on whoever could move freely in the room." His look slid to Harris and away. To Montclair, to Julian. "It still doesn't name the man." "No," Poirot agreed. "Names, always, we keep for last. But the piece, the one I have been waiting for, it sits now." He touched his breast pocket. "In the library earlier, Captain Hastings and I looked through Monsieur Belliveau's portfolio. A letter had walked from it days ago. I said nothing, because I lacked the pair to its shoes. In the cellar, I found it." He unfolded the small torn scrap with the 4 times penciled in a neat, tidy hand and laid it beside the register where Harris had written 7:15 a. "Man who writes his minutes also writes his threats." Compared Inspector the tremor at the S in Sam the burr of a nib that catches precisely the burr upon our anonymous letter this morning. The pen is not Latham's burr, sits at a different angle. It is another, kept in the study. One which writes Montclair's notes. The same little flaw, the same vanity in a flourish at the tails. Montclair's chair creaked. "You heap fantasies." "Not fantasies," Poirot said gently. "Proportions, pride and fear in equal measure. A rare bottle whose legend wobbles. A dealer who will not guarantee its romance. A nephew with quick hands to fetch char and keys. A hostess to be framed with a monogram and a window. A critic to soothe the room with praise. A table set like a score so that the first glass Bellevue must be the one that kills. For a heartbeat. only the clock spoke. In that small sound I felt the entire house leaning toward or away from a fall. Poirot looked from face to face as if counting silently, not suspects now but heartbeats. Then, with a curious lightness, he stepped back from the brink he had brought us to, and closed the little scrap of paper between finger and thumb. "Arsays," he said, almost merrily. "The last piece is where it should be. Now I have everything I need. But timing, always, is the grace of the thing." His glance flicked to the mantel clock. "We will permit half an hour for the tea to be made very strong. At 11 precisely. Inspector, you will be so kind as to ask everyone to the drawing-room." Julian's mouth curled. "Why wait, if you know?" "Because," Poirot replied, and his eyes, for the first time that evening, showed a steel that did not smile. "One among us has one more errand he is desperate to attempt. He believes, still, in the power of a last correction. I wish to see which door he chooses." He turned to Harris. "Bar the poor door below. Post a man at the study, and," Harris's voice softened, "lock away the place cards. They have survived one dinner. Let them not be eaten by a second." We broke from the table with that odd, breathless murmur that follows a conductor's lifted baton. The corridor outside was colder than I remembered. As we stepped into it, I felt the house take a long, small breath, the intake before confession, or before flight. Somewhere, unseen, a footfall quickened. A latch tested itself. A mind that had managed every detail rehearsed a last, impossible one. Poirot's hand touched my sleeve. "Come, Hastings. We will be at the right door when he reaches for the wrong one." Chapter 15. The door in the dark. The house seemed to settle after Poirot's announcement. Yet in that stillness there was an undercurrent like the faint tremor one feels when standing over hidden machinery. Somewhere behind the paneled walls, footsteps had begun to move in patterns, too deliberate to be idle. It was as if the entire building had joined in Poirot's experiment, offering its creaks, sighs, and distant taps as subtle cues for our attention. I remained close to him, as he had instructed. We moved not with haste, but with the unhurried purpose of two men who have all the time in the world, because we wished our quarry to believe exactly that. Poirot's eyes, however, missed nothing. They lingered on door frames, brushed over stairwells, and measured the rhythm of the noises that drifted through the hall. Barrow had stationed himself near the main entrance to the study. Harris, obedient and efficient, guarded the servants' passage to the wine cellar. The household had dispersed under a polite pretense of retiring until the appointed hour, but I could sense that none of them truly rested. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard sighed under the slow pressure of someone's weight. "Listen, Hastings," Poirot murmured, pausing beneath the half-landing of the main staircase. "That is not the tread of a servant. It is too careful. A servant walks to a task, not away from a thought." We moved toward the sound, the carpet muffling our steps. The air grew cooler near the back corridor, where the gas lamps burned lower and the scent of polish gave way to the faint dry dust of disuse. At the far end stood a narrow door, its brass handle dulled by age. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "That, mon ami, is the little gate to desperation," he said softly. The handle turned. A figure slipped through quickly, but not so quickly that the silhouette was unrecognizable. Montclair, his shoulders were hunched, as though to make himself smaller, and his hand clutched something long and thin, wrapped in cloth. He moved with the careful speed of a man who knows both time and danger, balanced against him. Poirot gestured for me to hold back, then followed with the quiet certainty of a shadow that knows its prey cannot hear it. The door had led into a disused service hallway. We passed old trunks stacked against the wall, their leather cracked and straps hanging limp like dead snakes. At the end was another door, narrower still, which Montclair eased open. A puff of cool, stale air escaped a smell of stone and moisture. "The cellar passage," Poirot whispered, "but not to fetch wine." We slipped inside before the door had fully closed, descending a short flight of worn steps. The space below was lit only by the glow of a single electric bulb, its wire sagging like an exhausted vine. Shadows pooled in the corners, hiding recesses that might have been shelves or niches. Montclair was bent over a low workbench, his wrapped bundle laid across it. He was untying the cloth with trembling fingers. Poirot stepped forward then, his voice calm but unyielding. "You will not find the proof gone, Monsieur. It was never here to be taken." Montclair froze. The cloth fell open to reveal not a weapon, but a narrow ledger, its pages yellowed and corners warped from damp. The ink had faded in places. but I could see columns of figures, names, and dates records kept in a hand that matched the neat, precise script on the scrap Poirot had shown earlier. "You'd think I came to hide this," Montclair said, his voice low, "but I came to burn it. You've already seen too much." Poirot's smile was almost kind. "Too much, and not enough. Destruction now is only an admission. The truth, it is safer than your silence." Montclair's jaw tightened. He reached toward a small brazier in the corner, its grate already holding the red ghost of embers. Poirot stepped closer, placing one small, immaculate shoe between Montclair and the brazier. "None," Poirot said simply. "We will leave it as it is, for the inspector's eyes. If you throw it in, I will pull it out, and you will have given yourself away with nothing in return." For a moment, Montclair's breathing was the only sound. Then, with a suddenness that startled me, he pushed the ledger toward Poirot. "Take it then, but it proves nothing of murder." Poirot accepted it without looking down. "It proves enough to make lies harder, and lies, monsieur, have been your companions for some time." We retraced our steps in silence, Poirot carrying the ledger as one might carry a fragile relic. As we reached the hall again, the mantel clock struck the half. Poirot's expression did not change, but I knew the timing pleased him. "Now, Hastings," he said, "the house is ready. The one who still hopes for rescue will know that rescue will not come. When we gather them, every heartbeat will sound in the silence, and the truth will be eager to step forward." We walked toward the drawing room. Behind us, the cellar door clicked shut, sealing away its damp air, and the ledgers whispered history until the moment. Poirot chose to open both. Chapter 16. The final gathering at 11. Precisely, the drawing room received us like a court. The lamps had been lowered a shade. The fire made a slow, obliging music. Inspector Barrow stood a little to one side, large and practical, while Harris, by some instinct older than service, had arranged chairs in a shallow crescent, facing the marble hearth. They came in under the hush that follows summons rather than invitation. Montclair first, pallor hidden beneath polish. Celeste Duval with her compact closed like a verdict. Colonel Rathbone as rigid as a drawn bayonet. Latham smoothing his hair as if there were a photographer. Elise Fortrin with her locket against the hollow of her throat, and Julian Marshing, whose lighter had been relegated to Barrow's pocket, along with the duplicate key. Poirot stood at the center, small and exact, as if his outline had been inked more firmly than the rest of us. He did not rattle his audience with drama. Instead, he began with courtesy, like a motor D explaining the menu. "Mesdames et messieurs, we will now conclude the act of confusion. We will set in order the minutes, the movements, and the memories. I will not accuse, I will demonstrate. At the end, the truth will be so little a surprise that even the murderer will welcome it as a relief." He placed upon the low table 3 objects: the small glass plate that had preserved the ring from Elise's setting, the crumpled paper twist of oak char, and the ledger Montclair had tried to consign to embers. The last he touched with a finger that might have been blessing or rebuke. "This is not a book of murder," he said, "but of fear, a ledger of acquisitions and boasts of provenance that is sometimes story, not history. It tells us why reputations stood tonight upon a thin sheet of ice. But it is the little things, the ring, the dust of char, that tell us how ice cracked." Barrow shifted. "Plain English, Poirot." "With pleasure," Poirot replied, smiling. "We have learned 3 truths. 1. The wine did not kill en masse. 1 glass killed by design. 2. The room was taught in advance to expect ash upon the tongue, so no one would question the bitterness when it arrived in a single place. 3. The scene after the death was rearranged, windows opened, stains displayed to implicate the wrong person." His gaze passed, without malice, over Celeste. She met it and allowed herself the smallest incline of the head to fix these truths. "We require a skeleton of time." He drew from his breast pocket the torn scrap with its tidy soldiers of minute marks and laid it beside Harris's cellar register. At 7:15 the bottle left its bed for the pantry. Between 7:19 and 8:03 the poor door to the cellar was opened and shut twice by the bearer of the duplicate key. In that interval, a lighter warmed a stubborn capsule. A pinch of oak char was fetched from the delivery passage where the air tastes of old barrels. At 8:10 note, the last figure the door again opened, not to prepare, but to arrange a future alibi so that when the taste of ash became the chorus, one window upstairs could sing the solo. Julian shifted, but Poirot did not look at him. At table, the host poured with ceremony, yet his hand avoided, by habit, one delicate obstacle near Madame Vautrin's place. That obstacle was a rim prepared before the guests satellitely kissed with Shah, so that the palate would find the expected bitterness. And beneath it, he raised a hand. Ah, not yet the name, only the principle. A compound harmless alone, fatal in reunion, laid thin as breath on the glass, but undetectable in the bowl. A man drinks, his first contact is the lip. Minutes later, the rest follows. Rathbone's jaw worked. Clever, Vilbert clever. Clever men, Poirot said softly, always overestimate the invisibility of their arrangements. Fortunately, habits are honest. The place cards were written by Madame Vautrin at the request of Harris. The smudge at her setting, rescued and set aside, preserved a ghost of the treated rim on the service plate. In the blue room the stain upon the sill imitates that ghost. Upon a napkin the same dull smear wears a monogram that is not Madame's by ownership but by convenience. His eyes flicked to Celeste. To frame a woman is an old art. Tonight it lacked finesse. Celeste's lips curved without warmth. I will pay you the extravagant compliment of gratitude, Monsieur Poirot. Accept instead the moderate courtesy of fairness, Madame, he returned. Now, a second skeleton. Monsieur Believer was a dealer who dealt also in assurances. He required a guarantor for a sale whose romance wobbled. He pressed our host for a benediction. He sought from Madame Duval a salon's blessing. He valued Monsieur Latham's praise as coin. In such a market, a whisper topples a price. If a man stands to lose a house of reputation with a single letter, he may choose to remove the letter, or he may choose to remove the letter writer Montclair's hands, immaculate on his knees, made the smallest fist, and opened again. Poirot's voice did not harden. It grew kinder. Monsieur Montclair is a man of arrangement, of decanters, and temperatures, and elegant sequences. He rehearsed the pour in private. He polished what might be asked to testify his bowls, the little altar of the cellar. He relied on punctual servants and an impulsive nephew to keep the clock from betraying him. He relied on theatre, the flourish, the Jefferson legend, the long syllable of Lafleur spoken like perfume. Barrow's head cocked. Are you accusing him? I am placing him, Poirot said. Accusation waits, for arrangements need accomplices. Who opened the pour door at 7:19? Who warmed the capsule when patience was short? Who has a petty gout for the small flame and the risk that amuses a hand? Julian's smile was a blade. Say it plainly, monsieur. You think I fetched the char? I think, Poirot replied. You fetched something. The char for certain. Perhaps more. You are proud of your nerve. You like the intimacy of a secret passage. You believe yourself a connoisseur of consequence. But here he lifted a finger. Here is the point where your nerve was hired as a courier by another man's pride. Julian's gaze flitted once to Montclair. So brief a glance one might have missed it. Poirot, let it hang in the air for all to consider. Now, he continued, one question remains. Who laid the fatal touch upon the glass? For that, we require neither courage nor theatre, but biology. Inspector, if you will indulge me, I asked the cook for a pinch of starch and the housemaid for a strip of litmus. Harris, the tray. Barrow made a noise of disbelief, but nodded to Harris, who brought a small tray upon which Poirot had arranged 3 items, a bowl of tepid water, a folded scrap of linen, and a little vial no wider than a match. We cannot resurrect last night, Poirot said, but we can test the language the rim spoke. The compound, I will not name it, is not polite to educate murderers, but it leaves, when it dries with contact of air and a trace of acidity, a faint reaction that a child could read with a schoolroom paper. He dipped the linen, brushed the glass plate's grey ring, pressed the strip. The edge blushed a reluctant violet. It is not char alone, he said quietly. It is char as veil. Beneath, a kiss that kills. A small stir moved through the room, not terror. Recognition. Celeste exhaled, long and silent. Latham looked away, ashamed of his earlier certainty. Rathbone's eyes closed once, approving the logic as one approves drill. Elisa's fingers tightened upon her locket and then relaxed, as if she had set a weight down at last. And now, Poirot said, as if concluding a pleasant lecture, we require each of you for a last little promenade of habit. Harris, the side table. Upon it lay 6 goblets, polished to an innocent shine. Poirot placed them in a row before us. I ask only this. Each of you will take the goblet you would have chosen last night, had you found it before the dinner, by size, by balance, by the way your hand likes its weight. No tricks, no labels, only touch. which is more truthful than taste. It was absurd and yet, to my surprise, persuasive. Rathbone lifted the heaviest, nodding at the sensible base. Latham chose the thinnest stem with a critic's vanity. Celeste selected a medium bowl with a rim barely flared. Elise took the plainest without hesitation. Julian, with a performance of indifference too studied to be real, let his fingers settle on the one whose stem bore a minuscule nick. Montclair, last, took the goblet whose balance sang to his hand like a tool long used. Poirot marked each with a discreet slip. Tiara's bean. Why this charade? Because the man who prepared the rim would choose, without thinking. The same profile, the same lip thickness, when the hand repeats a sign. Habit is the shadow that crime cannot lose. He turned to Barrow. Inspector, you will take the goblet Monsieur Montclair chose to the laboratory tomorrow. It will speak with the same reaction as this plate, or it will not. Either way, the picture is complete enough tonight for conscience to move ahead of chemistry. Montclair's voice came at last, soft and precise. You are a conjurer, Monsieur Poirot. You produce results from air. Poirot inclined his head. And you are a host who cannot bear a guest to spoil an evening. So you removed the only guest who could spoil a career. You framed a lady because her initials were convenient. You recruited a boy because his vanity was. You trusted a critic's need to be right and a soldier's need to be plain. You set the stage with the faith of a man who believes the world will applaud his arrangement. Enough, Barrow growled. Encore a minute, Poirot said softly, because we will end as we must not, with accusation, but with invitation. I invite the truth to relieve a tired heart. He looked not at Montclair but at Elise Vautrin. Madame, you placed the cards where you were told. In doing so, you saw what the rest did not. The small smear on your plate, the shifting of the card, the body's memory. You have carried that knowledge like a quiet burden. Will you set it down? Elise met his eyes for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was clear. I saw Monsieur Montclair touch the glass when the cloths were laid. It was very quick. I thought host's fussiness. Then I noticed the smear and moved the card to save the tablecloth. That is all. But when the wine tasted wrong, I knew that all was something. She turned slightly, not to Poirot, but to Montclair. I did not want it to be you, but wanting is not truth. Montclair looked briefly older. Not ruin. There are men for whom ruin is too dramatic, but thinner in the places where pride makes one look thick. He opened his mouth and closed it. Poirot bowed, very small. Merci, madame. He let the silence stand, warm and terrible. Then his voice, when it came, was gentle once more. Inspector, a half-hour more. I ask only that. At midnight, we will finish. Before that time there is always the possibility how to save an elegant surrender. He turned to us all with a little spread of the hands. To the library, if you please. The fire is warm there, and confession, it prefers warmth. We rose in a rustle that was almost respectful. As we filed through the door, I felt the house breathe again, less like a creature in pain and more like a place that had been waiting for a bad dream to end. Poirot, beside me, looked neither triumphant nor grim. He looked, if anything, relieved. The last piece, he murmured, almost to himself, has fallen. It remains only to let it stop rolling. In the corridor a floorboard lifted under a careful foot, the sound of someone turning not to run, but to face the room where the truth had finally taken a chair. Chapter 17. The library's quiet, ultimatum. The library, with its high shelves and green-shaded lamps, had the calm of a sanctuary that had outlived storms. The air smelt faintly of leather, polish, and the winter rain still tapping against the tall windows. Poirot entered first, his small figure drawing every gaze without command. Barrow stationed himself near the door, broad-shouldered and silent, the embodiment of a man who had seen enough to wait without fidgeting. Harris appeared moments later, as discreet as the turning of a page, arranging decanters on the sideboard, not as refreshment, but as prop. This was a room prepared for conversation rather than comfort. The suspects filed in with a certain hesitancy, their earlier postures of defense and dignity softened by the preceding hour's revelations. Montclair, still immaculate, but with the sheen of his composure dulled, took the armchair nearest the hearth, as though proximity to the fire might anchor him. Julian Marchand lounged not convincingly along the arm of a settee, his eyes darting between Montclair and Poirot, as if measuring the odds of some private wager. Celeste Duval sat erect, hands folded with a composure that looked too deliberate to be effortless. Elise Vautrin chose a seat farthest from Montclair, resting her locket in her palm as if it could occupy her thoughts. Colonel Rathbone stood instead of sitting, the disciplined lines of his figure casting a shadow that leaned toward the center of the room. Latham, arms crossed, found a corner where the lamplight barely touched him. Poirot remained standing, near the great writing desk that dominated one end of the room. He glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece, its ticking a patient metronome. "Madame et messieurs," he began softly, "the night grows late. The truth is now a guest among us. It sits quietly, like a cat in the dark, but it will move soon. I wish only that when it does, it will find us prepared." He walked slowly, hands clasped behind his back. What has been said in the drawing room has narrowed the field until it is no longer a field, but a path. A path walked by two people, one who held the plan entire, and one who assisted, willingly or not. I will not yet name them, though the names are no longer strangers to you. Instead, let us recall the sequence with clarity. Clarity is the oil that makes the little grey cells turn without friction. Montclair stirred, his voice calm but edged. "Is there purpose in rehearsing the humiliation, Monsieur Poirot?" "There is purpose," Poirot said evenly, "because even the guilty may find comfort in the order of events, and because those who have erred only by proximity will leave here lighter in the heart." He returned to the desk and, with careful precision, laid out the three key objects once more: the ledger, the paper twist of char, and the glass plate bearing the ghost of the poisoned rim. "First," he said, touching the plate, "a preparation small, subtle, requiring knowledge of the victim's habits and the dinner's arrangement. Second, a gesture to the char, a device to explain away the taste, planted in conversation so that its arrival on the tongue would be unremarkable. Third, his fingers rested on the ledger, the motive rooted not in hate, but in fear of a collapse that would bring down a carefully constructed reputation." Julian shifted. "And yet," he said lightly, "you have still not told us which of us you believe laid that preparation." Poirot looked at him for a long moment. "And I thought I detected the faintest shadow of sympathy." "Non, monsieur, I have not, because I prefer the truth to be offered rather than dragged. It is, how do you say, more elegant." He turned back to the room. "I have invited you here not to accuse but to allow the one who knows the truth to speak it, and to speak it freely. Inspector Barrow has kindly agreed that, should such a confession be made before midnight, it will be heard in this room, without spectacle, without the parade of a public arrest." The clock ticked on. The fire gave a muted pop, a tiny sound in the stillness. No one spoke. Poirot moved toward the shelves, tracing a finger along the spines, as though their titles offered him counsel. "I have always believed," he said, almost conversationally, "that guilt has weight. It may not be visible to the eye, but it bends the shoulders, it slows the voice, it shortens the patience. Tonight I have seen it grow heavier in one man as each minute passed, and I have seen it flicker, like a shadow, across the face of another, who did not expect to be part of the plan until he was drawn in." He paused, turning to Montclair. "Monsieur, you are a man who values the dignity of arrangements. You take pride in control, and yet control is a fragile thing, is it not? It requires constant maintenance. One loose thread." His gaze shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward Julian, and the whole tapestry can be pulled away. Montclair said nothing, but his hand tightened on the arm of his chair. Elise, who had been silent until now, spoke softly. "Monsieur, if you are asking for truth, perhaps it is better to let it be said and done. The house has been uneasy since the dinner." Celeste's eyes flicked toward her, the faintest narrowing betraying a thought unspoken. Rathbone cleared his throat as though to speak, then decided against it. Poirot inclined his head. "Madame, you are wise, but truth cannot be commanded, it must be chosen." He looked to Montclair again. "The choice, monsieur, is yours. I believe you understand the benefit of making it here, in the quiet, rather than later." The clock's hands crept toward the quarter hour. Outside, the rain had softened to a whisper, the sound like the slow turning of a page. Julian shifted again, then stood abruptly, walking to the sideboard to pour himself a drink from a decanter he did not bother to identify. He took a slow sip, then said, "It's not as simple as you make it, Poirot. You talk about plans and accomplices as if they're fixed things. Sometimes you help because it's amusing. Sometimes you don't even know you've been useful until later." Poirot did not move, but I thought I saw a flicker of interest pass through his eyes. "Indeed, monsieur, and did you find it amusing?" Julian's smile was thin. "Not anymore. He set the glass down, hard enough to make it ring against the wood, and resumed his seat without another word. The silence that followed was heavier than before, as if every person in the room had begun listening not to Poirot, but to their own thoughts. Poirot glanced once more at the clock. 15 minutes remain, he said gently. It is time enough, but not too much. He stepped away from the desk and stood near the fire, his hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. The room seemed to draw in on itself the warm light, the quiet ticking, the rain at the windows, all closing around the circle of figures who now waited for the next sound, the next shift, the next fracture in composure. And somewhere in that stillness, I felt it, the faint, almost imperceptible stir that comes when truth begins to lean toward the open-air. Chapter 18. The confession by the firelight. The mantel clock marked the hour with a soft chime, each note carrying through the library like the measured toll of an unseen judge. No one moved. The fire, its glow steady, cast long shadows along the shelves, making the books seem like silent witnesses waiting to record the moment. Poirot remained by the chair near the hearth, his gaze sweeping across the circle of faces. "It is time," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the hush without raising. "The one who holds the truth will speak now, because to keep it is to carry a weight that will not lessen." Montclair's jaw was set, but his eyes had shifted from the fire to the ledger on the desk. Julien sat rigid, his earlier nonchalance replaced by a restless energy that betrayed more than words could. Elise Vautrin's fingers curled tightly around her locket, while Celeste Duval sat as if carved from stone. Colonel Rathbone's stance was unchanged, but his gaze moved steadily between Montclair and Julien. Latham, half in shadow, might have been carved from the panelled wall. Poirot took a step forward. "Monsieur Montclair," he said softly, "you are a man who understands how a single false entry in a ledger can undo a lifetime's work. The victim, you knew, had begun to suspect, and so you feared exposure not for an act of malice, but for an act of desperation to keep your world intact. You prepared the poison with meticulous care, using the rim of his preferred glass, ensuring no one else would be touched by it." Montclair's lips parted, but no denial came. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, tightened until the knuckles showed white. Poirot turned his gaze to Julien. "And you, monsieur, you were not the architect, but the craftsman of a small distraction. You spoke of the burnt sugar at dinner, priming the taste, making any bitterness on the tongue seem harmless. You did this not from knowledge of the full plan, but from a fondness for playing a role in others' schemes, until you realized too late that the game was mortal." Julien gave a sharp, mirthless laugh. I thought it was a joke, one of Montclair's little exercises in humiliation for the old man. I didn't think. His voice trailed, the last words lost in the crackle of the fire. Montclair rose slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow toward Poirot. "Yes," he said, the word heavy. "It was me. I could see it coming, the collapse, the disgrace. One word from him to the board, and it would all have been stripped from me. I only meant to remove the obstacle. I did not plan for anyone else to be involved." His eyes moved briefly to Julien. "He was just convenient." Poirot stepped forward, but Poirot lifted a hand. "Merci, Inspector. Let us not forget this is still a house, and we are still guests. The formalities may wait until morning." Montclair gave a slow nod, his face unreadable now. As if the confession had taken more than guilt from him, it had taken the scaffolding of the man he had built for the world to see. Poirot straightened, smoothing his cuffs. "It is the great tragedy, mes amis, that those who believe themselves strongest are often those who will sacrifice the most to avoid appearing weak, and in doing so, they choose the path that ensures their ruin." The rain outside had stopped, leaving only the faint settling of the wind. One by one, the others rose, some silent, some exchanging glances that held more questions than answers. Harris moved to close the ledger, as if drawing a curtain over a final scene. As Barrow led Montclair from the room, Poirot remained by the fire, watching the flames curl around the logs. "You see, Hastings," he said at last, his tone almost reflective, "the truth will always find a way to breathe. One need only wait and listen for it." The clock ticked on. The library, relieved of its burden, returned to silence, and somewhere in that silence, I thought, the house itself exhaled.